In past years, the Law Review has focused on many diverse issues, including water issues, coal issues, health care, prison overcrowding. This year, building on the expertise of our own faculty, Professors Charles DiSalvo and Professor Friedberg, the Law Review focuses on civil resistance and its role in transitions to democracy. It is the College of Law's mission to prepare 21st century lawyers and leaders to serve the public, government, and business, both locally and globally. Today's topic supports this mission. As the Arab Spring has taught us, 21st century lawyers and leaders must recognize the power of civil resistance and its implications for democracy, for lawyers' clients, and for lawyers' responsibilities for broader systems of law that promote democracy and freedom. Until recently, today's topic seemed to be international. However, closer to home, the Occupy Wall Street movement, and the Occupy Morgantown movement, for that matter, reminds us that civil resistance and the work of making a democracy goes on here in the United States every day, as well as around the world. Today's conversation will help us understand our role in that work as lawyers and as leaders within our local and global communities. I'd like now to introduce Jesse Reckert, Editor-in-Chief of the West Virginia Law Review, Volume 114. Jesse will outline for us the structure of today's symposium.
Thank you, Dean McConnell. Well, as Dean McConnell said, I'm Jesse Reckert. I'm Editor-in-Chief of the West Virginia Law Review, Volume 114. And before I get to this outlining business, I want to take a moment to thank several people who've worked very hard to make today happen. First and foremost, I want to thank Kathleen Keogh-Griebel and Michael Stark. Katie and Mike, would you please stand up? Can we please have a round of applause for Katie and Mike? Katie and Mike are the article selection and symposium editors for Volume 114, and they have done an amazing job. Thank you. I also want to recognize all of our editors on the Law Review. This year, I think we've shown dedication, persistence, and willingness to tackle challenges that maybe were too big for us, but we muddle through. So thank you all for your hard work and dedication to the Law Review. I also want to thank Dean McConnell and Assistant Dean Armistead, who couldn't be with us this morning, for their continued support of the Law Review and the symposium. Thank you very much. Today's symposium is the product of a conversation that began with Dean McConnell and was carried on in the Law Review suite. Mike and Katie and I are sitting around one morning having coffee, and we're talking about this craziness that is going on in the Arab world. We're marveling that civil resistance, nonviolent protest, is happening in this most unlikely of regions. And even as we marveled at the bravery, the persistence of the protesters, we kept coming back to this one very lawyerly, very practical question of what happens next. How does this spirit, this commitment, turn into a sustainable democracy? So it seems a very simple question, but it's also very difficult to answer. Today's symposium is our attempt to answer that question. And so to sort of triangulate an answer by using three different perspectives. Our first perspective is empiricism. We'll look at the work of Professor Erica Chenoweth, who's with us today as our Donnelly speaker, who has made a study of nonviolent resistance across the globe and its connection to democracy. Second, we'll answer the question historically with the work of Professor James J. Friedberg, looking at the transition to democracy in Spain post-Franco and its implications for the Arab Spring, and also the work of Penelope Andrews in the transition to democracy in South Africa post-apartheid. And finally, we'll answer the question prescriptively, looking at policy responses to changes in governing regimes with the work of Professor Donald Kochan, talking about soft power and the use of philosophy and translation, and also Professor Daniel Serwer, looking at the United States' role and how it should respond. So we have our roadmap laid out for us. I want to take a second to sort of talk about rules of the road, because law students love rules. First, logistics. Please hold questions for Dr. Chenoweth until the roundtable discussion at the end of today's talks. I know it's awkward, but it's what we can do to keep rolling and on track. And it also means that you have to come back for the roundtable discussion. Otherwise, each set of papers will be followed by a question and answer session. We'll have 3 breaks throughout the morning to enable folks to leave to attend classes, one at 9:55 to 10, 10:50 to 11, and then 11:50 to noon. If you need to leave, please do so during those breaks. And then finally, we'll be hosting a reception in the lobby, and you're all welcome to join us then after today's symposium is over. I just realized that I've made an oversight. I did not discuss the roundtable discussion, so I apologize for that. Following our paper presentations, our own Professor Charles DiSalvo, who is himself an expert in civil disobedience, will be leading our presenters in a panel discussion, tying the threads of today's discussion together. I also want to take the opportunity to thank Professor DiSalvo for being our biggest supporter and our best critic as we put today together. He's been invaluable. Thank you. So now down to brass tacks. It's my pleasure today to introduce our Donnelly speaker, Dr. Erica Chenoweth. Actually, Dr. Chenoweth just joined us from a month in Berlin, so she's a little travel-worn, but certainly game. Dr. Chenoweth is a widely recognized authority on terrorism, insurgency, and nonviolent resistance. She holds a PhD and an MA in political science from the University of Colorado. She's an assistant professor of government at Wesleyan University, and currently she's serving as a visiting scholar in residence at the Institute of International Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Chenoweth has published over a dozen articles in scholarly journals and edited volumes, and has authored several books. Her most recent work, Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, co-written with Maria J. Steffen, is the basis for her talk today. So I'd like you all to join me in welcoming Professor Erica Chenoweth.
Morning. All right. So I was told that I would get a round of applause for at first just coming clean and admitting that I am a West Virginia University football fan. And I should applaud you for having a far less criminal team than the one from my own alma mater of University of Colorado. But that's not why we're here. I want to thank you for inviting me, and I'm always thrilled and also a little bit humbled to talk about this topic. I should say that I came to the topic of civil resistance rather reluctantly because I started out being a person who really focused on political violence, and I thought I was going to spend my whole life studying and understanding why people choose violence to get what they want, even in fairly liberal societies, and why people use terrorism and whether that works and how governments can stop it. And that's really what my training and background is in. But I went to this workshop by accident in June of 2006, and I was in the middle of finishing my doctoral thesis, which was on why terrorism happens so often in democratic countries. So kind of a guns and bombs person. And I went to this workshop because I got an email from a colleague who's also another terrorism scholar, and he said, this is the other side of the coin, might be interesting. And it was an announcement for a pedagogical workshop that was happening at Colorado College, kind of down the road from me. And the topic was people power. And the notion or the motivation behind the workshop was that they wanted to get security studies people like myself to incorporate people power onto our syllabi. And my first reaction to this was, this is incredibly naive of them, but it's free, and it's in a really nice part of Colorado, so I'll apply. And I got in, and they sent me this huge box of books. And the books were by people like Gene Sharp and Peter Ackerman and Jack Duvall and Stephen Zunis and Kurt Schock, and then a bunch of other articles and things. And I read them, and three things kept popping through my mind, which I see repeated over and over again in the popular media and in scholarship on the topic. So what they were saying is that civil resistance could be a superior strategic choice to violent insurgency. And they made a bunch of theoretical claims to that effect, and they provided a bunch of historical evidence about that from cases like in the Philippines, Serbia, and in other places where where nonviolent resistance had worked even when violent resistance hadn't. And civil resistance was a term that was not very familiar to me. And so what it really means, and when I talk about it, what I mean is that civil resistance is a method of active conflict that unarmed civilians prosecute against an opponent, usually to combat some kind of shared grievance of injustice or oppression, but not always. And they never, or they rarely threaten or use physical force against the opponent. So they're not going to harm the other side. They're just applying dozens or hundreds of different nonviolent weapons, like protests, strikes, boycotts, go slow demonstrations, stay away demonstrations, rallies, different types of actions that put pressure on the opponent to leverage the outcomes they want, short of using or threatening to use physical force against the opponent. So that's what civil resistance is. And I thought it was a rather naive proposition to say that this could work better than blowing things up. And the main reasons were threefold. These are the major hesitations I had. The first one is that states can easily crush nonviolent movements. All they have to do is use or demonstrate massive violent force, and nonviolent resistance can't work. So that was my hesitation number one. Hesitation number two is, well, you know, maybe nonviolent resistance can work if you want things that are kind of easy to get, like civil rights or environmental rights or gender rights or economic rights, things that are real easy to get. But if you want really tough things, like you want to remove a dictator, or you want to secede your territory and become an independent country, or you want to liberate yourself from a foreign military occupation, you can't use nonviolent resistance. Those are the types of things that we usually associate with violence. And that's probably because violence is necessary in those cases. And then the third notion I had is that when we see violence, it's because it needs to happen. Probably these people have already tried nonviolent resistance and found it failing. And so they were forced to use violence to confront the opponent. And so I kind of made this reverse inference that if we see violence, it was necessary, it was a last resort, and it's always strategically justified. And because of that, when we see nonviolent resistance, it's because they didn't actually confront so much difficulty in getting what they wanted that they had to escalate into using violence. So nonviolent resistance isn't really the force for change. It's a symptom that change is already underway. And people just kind of come out and join in the streets to celebrate in a way that change is happening. But they're not causing the change. So these were the sort of skeptical interpretations I had. So I went to this workshop. And as you can imagine, I was the person in the back of the room who was super unpopular by the end of the week, because everybody else was trying to be really optimistic and really grab onto these notions, and I kept sort of hammering these points, like, you know, I just don't think it's going to work. You offer some very compelling cases, but I don't think it generalizes to the full universe of cases, as it were. And so they kept saying, well, we're not aware if anybody's actually looked at that question. So by the end of the week, I took out like a scrap of paper and wrote down a research design of how one might study this question. And I came up with a research design that was approximately this, where I went to this data set called the Correlates of War data set. And this is the data set where if you want to know whether a war has happened between 1800 and today, you go to the Correlates of War data set. And if there are more than 1,000 people that have been killed in battle and there are at least 2 armed groups competing for power in a context, then it's in the Correlates of War. So I looked at that, and I isolated the cases where it was just internal conflict or insurgency. And they had to be looking at 3 major goals. They had to be looking to remove a dictator, to achieve self-liberation from a foreign military occupation, or to secede, to become an independent country. And so I set those aside, and then I went and searched out for the correlates of nonviolent conflict data set, and believe it or not, there was no such thing. So I actually had to develop it myself. And I tried to approximate these same conditions for major nonviolent campaigns, civil resistance campaigns from 1900 to 2006. And by approximate the same conditions, what I mean is that I just picked these campaigns where they were looking for really hard stuff, like the removal of a dictator anti-occupation, or secession, and I excluded everything else. So no civil rights, no economic rights, no justice, none of that. Those are all out. It's just the really hard stuff, because I was the skeptic, and I wanted to prove that it didn't work. The second thing is that I looked for only ones that were already major nonviolent campaigns, so that had escalated to the point where they already had more than 1,000 people participating visibly in a coordinated set of observable tactics. So a one-off protest where there were 400,000 people and then nothing ever happened isn't a campaign. A campaign is one where there's some kind of organization and coordination where they're linking tactics together strategically toward a common aim. So a protest followed by a strike, followed by another protest and a series of rallies and demonstrations, all collecting to put pressure on an opponent for one of these three really difficult demands. So after I got this initial list, I sent it out to dozens of experts around the world and asked them to comment on the list, and particularly to identify ones that weren't well known, campaigns that had failed or been crushed in their early stages, so they never really flourished. And I ended up with a pretty compelling list that I'm comfortable defending of over 300 campaigns of nonviolent and violent resistance for these three types of goals during this entire time period. So over 100 years is the universe of cases all around the world. So then I assigned a value to their success or failure, whether they succeeded, and if they succeeded, that means they had to achieve 100% of what they set out to achieve, regime change, anti-occupation, or secession. If they achieved significant territorial autonomy or they forced a dictator to hold competitive elections and he later lost, that would count as a partial success, not a full success. And then everything else is failure. And we applied the same criteria to both nonviolent and violent campaigns. Then I went through and I assigned a number of values to different variables, because the theory of civil resistance that people like Gene Sharp were promoting suggested that civil resistance campaigns work by having people apply pressure to the pillars of support that prop up a regime. And by pillars of support, they mean things like security forces, economic elites, business elites, educational elites, media, the different bodies or institutions within society that the regime relies upon to stay in power. And the regime relies upon to repress and to co-opt nonviolent movements or violent insurgencies. And so the argument that Sharp and others made is that nonviolent movements succeed when they're able to degrade the obedience of those pillars of support, so that when the chips are down and the regime tries to crush the movement, those pillars of support give away beneath the leader. So the premise here is that no government stays in power without the obedience and cooperation of those that are supporting it. So because of that, there are a number of hypotheses to test, and one of them is, do people matter? So I measured the amount of participants in these different campaigns. And the way that we did this was just by looking at the peak number of observed participants in the nonviolent and violent campaigns. The second thing we looked at was security force loyalty shifts, whether security forces actually either shifted loyalty to the movement or simply refused to follow orders to repress the movement. And if that happened, I called that a hard test, because security forces are typically the most hardline members of society. And if they turn, then the movement is highly successful. I also looked at this very cynical belief that government brutality against a nonviolent campaign will end it and will preclude it from succeeding. And so I collected data on government repression. You may not be surprised to find out that over 90% of these campaigns, whether nonviolent or violent, were violently repressed. And it's because they were asking for such extreme demands. I also looked at the notion of whether these movements received material aid from an outside state. In the case of nonviolent movements, this would be money. And in the case of violent movements, it would be money or weapons. And the reason I was interested in this is because of the claim often made that the only way nonviolent movements win is when they're supported by an outside power. So I wanted to test that. And then I looked at a bunch of different variables that describe the state opponent. What type of country it was. Was it a democracy or a non-democracy? What types of capabilities did it have at its disposal to leverage against and wield against the movements? What was the composition and measure of its population? And other things like this that we want to control for so that the data aren't distorted in certain directions. So after I got all that, I ran my test, and I found some really mind-blowing results. The first thing is that nonviolent movements that fit these criteria that I've described were over twice as successful as violent campaigns. They are also more than twice as likely to achieve partial success or major concessions from the opponent than violent campaigns, and violent campaigns are much more likely to fail. Not only that, but the trend of the success of civil resistance is increasing over time. So you can see that in the past 40 years, nonviolent resistance is becoming a more effective weapon, and violent insurgency is becoming less effective. So this immediately caused us to drill down into the data even further to find out, why is this happening? Why is nonviolent resistance working so well? In spite of all of the research in my field which completely discounts it as an ineffective method of conflict. And what we found is that nonviolent resistance is much better suited to attracting a wide and diverse group of participants from society. And it turns out that participation is really important, and it's for the exact reason that theorists of civil resistance have anticipated. So check out this graph. This just shows the effects of the number of participants, and that should say participants per 1,000 logged, on the probability that a campaign will achieve total success. So it's very difficult to interpret these numbers because these are logarithmic values. But the way that I would interpret it here is that if you get yourself into the range where your movement is 10+% of the society, then you're approaching 90% likelihood of success. In other words, almost nobody, no dictator in the world, or no military occupation in the world can sustain itself when 10% plus of the population is engaged in civil resistance. If you move down into this range where you're looking at 5 to 10%, you get down to still a pretty good chance of success, over 60%, which is pretty good odds for any campaign. And down here at the lower end, what you'll see is this is basically just a few thousand participants in a movement. They've got less than a 10% chance of success. So participation matters. And the question is, why do nonviolent movements do better with attracting participants than violent ones? We make the claim that there are essentially barriers to participation in any kind of movement, whether it's nonviolent or violent. And nonviolent movements have 4 specific advantages in lowering barriers to participation. The first is a physical advantage. So let's just assume that you are a person who lives in one of these societies, and you've decided you want to participate in a campaign. But you've got some reservations. And the first one is that you know that if you join the armed campaign, which is going on, then you're going to have some physical demands on you. In order to be good at what you do, you're probably going to have to do some training. I was in ROTC in college. Does everybody know what ROTC is? And I was going to go and be a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army after I graduated. But I hated getting up at 4 in the morning and running blood on. So I quit and did something else. And basically, a lot of people share this same and they don't actually want to engage in heavy physical training. They don't want to subject themselves to the physical hardships of living life on the run as an insurgent, which often requires camping in really cold mountains or in really hot jungles for really extended periods of time. And turns out there aren't huge proportions of the population that are willing to subject themselves to that, even for a really good cause. In fact, I doubt that this lady right here would be willing to do that. But she is willing to stand there in front of tanks because it's not physically demanding to do that. Risky? Yes. But physically demanding? No. She has an aide to help her stand. And when you have nonviolent tactics that don't require physical agility and physical commitment, you open the possibility that people who wouldn't otherwise participate because of physical demand, that they will participate because you're not asking much of them. In fact, a couple weeks ago, you probably heard that my fellow Connecticuters were hit with a horrible snowstorm. And the National Weather Service was saying to them, go stock up on food for like a week or something, and then stay at home and play Xbox until the electricity goes out. Well, it turns out that people are certainly happy with that, right? But in the context of a civil resistance campaign, a stay-at-home demonstration where people stock up on food and play Xbox for a week can be an extremely powerful, nonviolent resistance strategy. And it turns out that it's available to anybody. Anybody can stay home for a day or for a week if they really are committed to the cause. The second thing is that there are lower commitment barriers to participation. So by this, what I mean is that when you go and join an armed group, or let's say you kind of accidentally find yourself in an armed group because you committed violence against, some government officials in the street or something, and it just runs to the hills, you're going to have to say goodbye to a lot of things. You're going to have to say goodbye to your day job, maybe your family, maybe your friends. It's a major lifestyle change to join an armed group, like a really major one. And in fact, you can't always get out. So once you're in, you're usually in for a while. In fact, many armed groups require people to come to them for a haven to actually kill somebody on the other side to demonstrate that they're not informants, because they're clandestine and it's a very high-risk situation. Now, you're never going to be asked to do that if you're in a nonviolent campaign, because it's nonviolent. You're not going to be asked to kill somebody and demonstrate your commitment. You might be asked to join in every once in a while, but they'll also understand if you don't. You don't have to quit your day job or say goodbye to your friends and family to be an active member of a nonviolent campaign. There are also lower informational barriers. What I mean by this is that all armed groups have a major communication problem. And they try to signal how big they are by their acts. But their acts are organized and often even conducted through clandestine means. So they're usually planning underground, and they're trying to demonstrate through propaganda and by explosions that they're big and that they're powerful and that they're going to win. But people can't infer from explosions just really how big you are. And so if I'm thinking about joining the movement, I want to see evidence before I go to the secret hiding place so that I know whether I'm going to see 6 people or 600 people. So with a nonviolent campaign, whose many tactics are very visible and public, it's much easier for people to gauge with the risk profile how many people are already involved. And it turns out that people, it's very important for people to feel safe. So imagine you're this person who lives in a very oppressive society. Your neighbor comes to your house one evening and says, we're going to have a gathering in the public square tonight, 8 o'clock down the street. And here's a little flyer that tells you where the getaway route is, because we anticipate that the regime will be there and that they're going to start cracking things. So be ready for that. But we're gathering at 8 o'clock. Now, the typical person is not going to show up at 7:55, right? They're going to wait and see. They're going to look down and say, how many people are already out in the square? Maybe around 8:15. And because our data set's only looking at movements that have already expanded it to fairly large groups of over 1,000 people, they look out and they see, wow, there's a couple thousand people out there. And maybe I'll go stand in the middle. Maybe not so much in the front line, but I'll stand in the middle. And then all of a sudden you get a huge gathering of people, safety numbers, the risk profile goes down, and the informational problem is overcome. You know how many there are, and how many you can expect to join when you show up. So then there are also lower moral barriers to participation. And this is actually something that's really difficult to quantify. But it is true that most people have at least some kind of period of introspection that they have to think about whether they're willing to kill other people for a cause. So when they've really done the work to reduce their hesitation to killing, even in combat situations. The bottom line here is that that's not on the table with nonviolent resistance, and you don't have to invest resources in that type of training to get people to participate. So what are the effects of participation? This slide shows the difference between having a bunch of participants in a violent campaign and having a bunch of participants in a nonviolent campaign, and now how that affects the probability that security forces will shift their loyalty during the campaign. So here what you see is that in a violent campaign, the probability that security forces will shift their loyalty hovers around 20%. It doesn't go up much from there. In fact, if we separated this out into its own data set, it wouldn't even be statistically significant, meaning there's no effect. The more people you get in a violent campaign, it doesn't really increase your chances of causing security force defections. Why? Because the more people who are shooting at you, the more you come together with your comrades and defend yourself. So you're not really thinking, they're shooting at us. Maybe we should listen to what they're saying. Maybe they have a good point. Usually what you're doing is you're gathering together and you're defending yourself. Nonviolent campaigns, on the other hand, the more people they get, and especially the more diverse the participation is, the more access they have to their neighbors and their friends and their parents and the other people that they know in the different pillars of support. And they demonstrate to them that this movement is a popular movement, has widespread support, and we are not threatening you, and you're a part of us. And over time, the more people you get, look at the effects on the probability security forces defect. It goes through the roof. And in fact, this is only security force defections. This doesn't look at things like civilian bureaucrats or state media or the other pillars of support that might defect. This is the hard case. So have you ever heard of the notion of pillow diplomacy? Maybe people who are married have. Basically, it's the notion that, let's say you're a general in the army, and you get the order come down from above that there's this group of student protesters, and you're going to go and you're going to shoot at them. You're going to end this thing right now, and take the tanks in, roll them in, and crush them. Now, you're a good general. You're not going to hesitate for this. But you happen to be married to a woman who's really prominent in the state educational system, and you go out and you fulfill your duty that day, and you blow away a bunch of students, and you come home that night, and your wife says to you, I saw some of my students in that crowd, and I cannot believe what you did to them today. And you're sleeping on the couch with me. Right? Now, of course, the general is probably not going to go out and join the protesters when this happens in the home. But the point is that if this happens in the home week after week after week, because the general keeps following orders and his wife grows farther and far away from him, it turns out these things actually have effects on the micro level for whether people will continue to obey when they get orders to do things that are causing problems for them in their personal life. And these things can have major consequences for the fate of nations. And in fact, week after week after week, if this guy keeps getting mad by his wife, he may not join the opposition, but there may come one day when he gets the order to go out and shoot into the crowd, and he decides to call in sick to work that day, so that he doesn't have to show up. And that's all we're looking for. We don't need him to join the revolution. We just need him to call in sick. And then we need him to call the junior officers and tell them to call in sick. That's it. And it's just, it's on paper as fasting for illness. That's all we need. So what about this notion that repression can crush a movement? Well, it's bad for movements. There should never be any martyrs out there who willfully subject themselves to repression unnecessarily. It's not good for movements, that's for sure. But we still see nonviolent movements outperforming violent campaigns by over 2 to 1 under extremely repressive circumstances. The question is, why is that? Because it's counterintuitive to what most analysts had expected. There are 2 reasons. The first is that repression can backfire. Here we see Bashar al-Assad shooting into nonviolent protesters and counting how many he's gotten so far, sitting as a candidate for the UN Human Rights Council, which he has been. Thank you. Look at the way that they're looking at him, with frowns on their faces. Right? You're not coming on the Human Rights Council. You're going to pay internationally for what you're doing domestically these days. The other thing that can accidentally happen is you can have domestic backfire. Now, backfire is the notion that your repression is counterproductive. Because because it produces the opposite effect of what it's intended to do. In this case, the repression is intended to go out and make people go home. But instead, oops, one of your security forces was seen riding around on the shoulders of the protesters. That's not good. Another thing that could happen is that it creates such moral outrage that you crack down on peaceful protesters that the next day twice as many people turn out. This doesn't always happen, as I said, but it's much more likely to happen if the repression is against a nonviolent campaign than if it's against a violent insurgency, where even people who sympathize with the violent insurgency understand why the state is cracking down on them. States are supposed to enjoy the monopoly on the use of force. It's one thing that actually makes them states. And so most people understand in the norms of today's society why states would try to crush armed threats. The other reason that repression doesn't necessarily always doom nonviolent movements is because they have an extremely wide array of tactics available to them. If you've got a ton of people participating, then you're capable of launching actions that are very concentrated, like protests or demonstrations or rallies where people come together in a public space and apply pressure to the other side. Or you can have tactics of dispersion. This is a general strike in Kashmir. This is where people stop doing what the government wants them to. They go home and stay home for a really long time. It hits the economic elites in the wallet. It's very upsetting. And the more that they can coordinate these types of activities, the more leverage they're going to have over the different pillars of support. Now, if you have wide membership, which you can as a nonviolent movement, then you're capable of having general strikes because you can coordinate that type of activity among the members that are already active in your movement. And the other thing about strikes and other methods of dispersion is that they're extremely difficult to repress. So the Iranian Revolution from 78 to 79 is called the 100 Days Revolution. And about the first 90 days of it were almost entirely methods of protest and demonstration and other concentrated methods. Now these brought people together in a public space and they showed solidarity and they showed the enormous growing membership of over 10% of the Iranian population in the revolution. But they were also pretty predictable. They came to the same public space time after time, and all the regime had to do was show up there, make a circle, and fire. And that's what they did. They killed a lot of people, and it also started to really reduce the morale of the group. So what did they do? In the last 10 days, they figured out what we need to do is hit the Shah and the wallet. And we know that the only source of his income remains oil. So they convinced the oil workers to strike. And when the oil workers struck, what they did was stay home, and the Shah sent the security forces door to door, dragged the oil workers back to the oil fields, and they worked at half pace. And then they went home, and the next morning they didn't show up either. So we had to send the security forces back out, door to door, drag the oil workers to work, where they worked at half pace. A very highly coordinated and sophisticated nonviolent method that convinced those security forces that they weren't going to get their next paycheck. And so they stopped supporting the Shah, and within days he had to take a helicopter out of the country. So what about this notion about external support? Does it help nonviolent movements or not? And are nonviolent movements really just puppets of foreign powers that want to see their own values represented in the society? Well, again, this is a little bit hard to interpret because it's predictive values. But what it's basically saying is that about 40-some% of violent insurgencies get material aid from the foreign state, guns or money. And less than 10% of nonviolent campaigns do. Now, after having talked to a lot of different government officials here and abroad, this no longer surprises me, given that because nonviolent campaigns typically don't involve things exploding, they hardly even recognize they exist until they've toppled a dictator, and then everybody goes, what happened? We didn't even notice anything was happening. Because they're very focused on violent stuff, which I understand because I was that way too. But basically, violent campaigns often get support, and it's actually much more useful for them. They which is a little also, like I said, counterintuitive. So it is true that in about 25% of the cases of violent insurgency, we see them succeed. But the question that remains is, when violent campaigns succeed, was it worth it for them to use violence to get what they wanted? So here's a picture of a child in Libya playing with a very powerful automatic weapon. Here's one of my favorite and also my least favorite signs from a recent election in Liberia, where it says ballots, not bullets. And there's a hand here that says, please stop the violence. And then here's a little sign that has a picture of two Kalashnikovs with no, and then a picture of a ballot box with a hand putting a vote in, like, yes, please do this. And this is a UN program to try to stop having election violence before elections in Liberia, a place, of course, where a lot of civil wars have gone on. And then up here we see mass graves in Libya related to the recent revolution. And so the reason I show these pictures is because Maria and I wanted to look at what the long-term consequences are of violent versus nonviolent resistance in countries. What happens after the conflict is over in these places? And in our book, we look at just democracy and civil peace, whether the countries are more or less democratic, and whether they experience civil peace or stability afterward. And also lately, I've just been looking at fatalities in the Arab Spring. So let me show you this first, because this is more recent stuff. So the bottom three are violent or at least mixed campaigns, and the top four are nonviolent campaigns, primarily. So in Tunisia, 2011, there were about 221 dead civilians killed in the anti-Ben Ali uprising. In Bahrain, there have been about 54 reported deaths. There may be more like 80 there, but it's pretty low. Ongoing conflict. In Syria, we just got news yesterday that it's about 3,500. Probably it's more like 5,000, but nevertheless, the bloodiest so far of the Arab Spring conflicts. In Egypt, against Mubarak, there were about 875 deaths. So there was blood everywhere, right? But in Yemen, there have been over 1,700 killed, primarily since the violence started. In Libya in 2011, official reports are around 30,000, but the estimates are actually about 50,000 dead. That was a violent uprising. And in Syria in 1982, which is only a 3-week-long campaign by an armed insurgency in Hama, the Syrian government killed 40,000 people and also scattered another 200,000 who then became internally displaced persons. The idea here is that when a country uses arms against a very well-armed dictator or involves the international community, which has lots of bombs, but they don't really usually hit the targets that they mean to, you're looking at a massive scale of death in a society. And even where massive death is happening against nonviolent resistance, it pales in comparison to what happens when you take up arms. You take up arms, you unleash the full power, unrestricted, of your opponent. And they will be absolutely happy to surround your town, as they did in Hama in 1982, and completely flatten the place. And it's never really recovered. What about the effects of nonviolent versus violent resistance on the probability that the country will become a democracy ultimately? Well, fascinatingly, we find extremely strong support for the notion that if you have a nonviolent campaign in your country, 5 years after, just 5 years after the campaign is over, the chances your country is a democracy, which is like an advanced democracy, we use a very high threshold, is 41%. And that's compared with only 4% if the country is facing a violent insurgency. And this controls for a number of different features that typically are associated with democratization, including the level of democracy while the campaign's going on. So even when we account for those things, we see this extreme divergence. And the reason is because when people engage in nonviolent resistance, they're essentially, as Jack Duvall likes to say, doing democracy before democracy is open for business. They create institutions within the campaigns that reinforce norms of nonviolent conflict resolution and also establish a norm in the society that we do business nonviolently. And we set up institutions when we win that replicate this type of contestation. In terms of civil peace, we also see advantages for when nonviolent campaigns go on. 28% of countries where a nonviolent uprising has happened experience a relapse into civil war within 10 years, but 43% of violent insurgencies see a relapse. So it's a 15% reduction, which if you live in one of these countries, you'd probably be willing to accept. So I want to suggest that we should try to move toward a new conventional wisdom, and perhaps one that is a little less skeptical than the one I had when I started. And I also have to confess that it took a long time to write this book, and part of the reason is because I myself found it hard to believe the results. You know, and you have to ask yourself when you're a person like me then, why do I want to think that violence works? Like, it's a very difficult notion to let go of. And fortunately now I've sort of embraced this new conventional wisdom, and I hope you'll help me to share it with others. And the first is that actually violent resistance, even though a lot of people say that they're justified in using it strategically, it's not justified strategically. It could be justified for a bunch of other reasons, like revenge or even the moral high ground that they think they have by using it. But it's rarely strategically necessary because there is a realistic alternative to using violent insurgency. The second point is that even against brutal regimes, nonviolent resistance maintains this strategic advantage because of backfire and the moral outrage that repression produces, and also the widespread tactical diversity available to large campaigns. And then the final point is that nonviolent resistance tends to produce countries that we'd actually want to live in, compared with a lot of violent insurgencies that degrade the institutions and make countries spiral into cycles of conflict that they find very difficult to climb out of. So I think I'm going to leave it there and give you all my information so that you can harass me and contest these ideas. And I'm going to be really happy to entertain your questions during these follow-up panels. Thanks.
We have time for a very short question period.
Sure.
If you're willing to take a question. Does anyone have a question from the audience that he or she would like to ask right now? John Mark.
Professor Chenoweth, you said that in your research that rarely was violent resistance campaigns ever strategically advantageous to them. Do you have any examples where it was, and were there any common characteristics that made those reasons different than all the other ones where it wasn't successful?
Yeah. So the only cases where I think that it can be justified on strategic grounds are cases of secession. And the reason is because we find in our data that there's no strategic advantage to using nonviolent resistance in cases of secession, because secession is really hard to achieve. But what we actually see is that neither nonviolent nor violent resistance works in that case. That is just extremely difficult to achieve using any type of civilian or guerrilla-led resistance, and it essentially has to be arbitrated from outside. And so to that effect, the question is, how do you get outside support? Unfortunately, it seems that to get outside military support, you have to be a violent insurgency. To my knowledge, there has never been an outside military intervention to support a civil resistance campaign. But there have been many to support armed insurgencies. So that's kind of, and I might be wrong about that, but the other thing to think about is if that you don't want a military intervention and you want maybe like peacekeeping operation or something along those lines, the question is, how do you appeal to the international community and internationalize your conflict in a way that makes people feel comfortable defending you? And it may be possible to do that using civil resistance. But I think that either way is a crapshoot, and secession is just really hard. And this is like a really well-documented notion from lots of conflict literature.
Thank you, Professor Chenow. We'll take our first class change break now and resume at 10 o'clock sharp. Thank you. As Jesse indicated earlier, I'm Charles DiSalvo, and I'm honored to be the moderator for the next couple of hours. In this hour, we're going to hear from two more of our speakers, Professor Penny Andrews and Professor James Friedberg. I'm going to introduce both of them now. Professor Andrews will then speak for 20 minutes, and Professor Friedberg will follow for about 20 minutes after her, and then we will have 5 or 10 minutes for questions. Professor Friedberg is the Hale J. and Roscoe P. Poston Professor of Law here at the College of Law. He's taught international law and comparative law for over 3 decades. He's studied democratic transitions in, and he's lived in, Bulgaria, Macedonia, Ireland, Spain, and Morocco. He's taught at WVU since 1980, with time off for visits to the University of Pittsburgh and the University of Hawaii Law Schools and Cambridge University. He's a graduate of the Harvard Law School. He is one terrible poker player, but he is an expert on Spain's nonviolent transition to democracy, and that's what he will speak with us about this morning. Professor Andrews is known internationally for her human rights scholarship. She's edited 2 books, Post-Apartheid Constitutions and Law and Rights. She'll soon be out with another book, From Cape Town to Kabul, Reconsidering Women's Human Rights. She's the editor of the International Review of Constitutionalism. Professor Andrews has taught law all across the globe, from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in her native South Africa, to La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia, to the City University of New York, where she currently is, and is serving as Associate Dean and Professor of Law. I would guess, however, that the distinction of which she is most proud is the scholarship that was established in her honor to benefit disadvantaged black South African college students. Please join me in welcoming Professor Penny Andrews.
Good morning, and thank you for that lovely introduction. Let me start by thanking the team at the University, the West Virginia Law Review. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I know one of the students, Dallas, sorry I forget your last name, I forget everything, picked me up at the airport late last night and drove me back here. I'm very appreciative. I also want to thank Dr. Chenoweth, who just set this terrific tone for the conference. There's so many questions that you raised, and I want to spend the time just responding to your talk, but I can't do that. I just want to take a minute to say something that your dean has not heard me say. I came to the City University of New York in 1993 after I taught law in Australia for a few years, and Joyce McConnell was then the torts professor. And Joyce McConnell was like a mentor, and she essentially turned me into an effective teacher. She's one of the best teachers of torts that I've ever witnessed. And I know that now she's a beloved dean across the country. I hope that she's a beloved dean. I suspect that she is here. And you're very, very lucky to have her. So thank you, Joyce. I'm going to be talking about the role of South Africa's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the transition to democracy. But I thought what I'd do is, just in light of the comments this morning from Dr. Chenoweth, to just refer a little to the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring. Because I've been interested in watching the events unfold on television and in the media, and thinking about the transition to democracy in South Africa, in which I was very, very deeply involved. And I was looking at the differences between what is happening now and what happened with us, starting with the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990 and the establishment of a first democratic government in 1994. And I sort of targeted, I thought of 5 features that distinguished South Africa then and Libya, Tunisia, Egypt now. The first is that our struggle was a pre-internet struggle. So the technology and the information to support what is going on globally, or certainly what is going on in Libya and how it's transmitted globally. There was no Facebook, no Twitter. And I think that creates a difference. I'm not sure if it's a qualitative difference, a quantitative difference, but it is a difference. The second is that all these movements appear to be bereft of a central figure like Nelson Mandela. Our struggle, in many ways, was successful because Nelson Mandela became the central person. He became the sort of moral compass of the movement. And I may be wrong, but my sense is that there's not a central figure around which the globe is gelling. We gel around the values, and we gel around the principles, but there's not one central figure. Whether that's good or bad, I'm just observing these differences. The third is that when South Africa was struggling for democracy, the anti-apartheid movement was what I sort of regard as the pre-hegemonic human rights movement. What I mean by that is that at the end of the 20th century, the human rights movement, 40 years of human rights activism since the establishment of the United Nations in the mid-century, last century, meant that revolutions were largely centered around rights, human rights, the rights revolution. South Africa was caught at a time when the revolution was about redistribution. The world was a different world. It was about socialism, communism on the one hand, capitalism on the other. That's the difference. The fault lines were different. By the time South Africa negotiated a constitution, it was clear that the language of rights was the language of progressive politics. It was the hegemonic language. But before that, it was not so clear. So that is another difference. The fault lines now, I think, are different. Some people talk about the fault lines being Islam versus Christianity and so on. I think it's far more complicated than that. But clearly it's a different fault line from communism versus capitalism. And the fifth, and this is an ongoing, I don't know how this plays out, but South Africa in many ways, I came to South Africa in the mid-80s as a graduate student, and at that time the anti-apartheid movement was very, very powerful. And my sense was that the civil rights movement influenced how the anti-apartheid movement was conducted in this country. African Americans felt that the anti-apartheid movement, that was my sense, was also their struggle. And there was a sort of universal narrative about good and evil, black and white, and so on. It was never that simple as we see things unfolding in South Africa now. But the narrative now is a little more complicated. It is unclear. It's not just a story of good and evil, even though people want to think about it in that way. And the forward trajectory is not in many ways as simplified as the forward trajectory was in South Africa. So those are just the sort of 5 features that I see as a difference between what's happening in the North African Arab countries and what happened in South Africa. So let me just talk about the role of the TRC. And I've subtitled it, The Bridge from the Apartheid Past to the Democratic Future. When I was sent the invitation to this conference, I was asked, all of the speakers were asked to address these questions. The one question, what follows in the wake of successful civil resistance? In other words, how can the energy, promise, and spirit of civil resistance be harnessed to produce enduring democracies? So I just want to talk a little bit about South Africa before the bridge was established, how the bridge came about, and then the TRC as that bridge. As I mentioned to Dr. Chenoweth, that South Africa was unique in several ways, in that there was both civil resistance in the country involving the trade unions, the churches, non-governmental organizations, ordinary citizens, civil society. But there was also a liberation movement in exile. South Africa was a hybrid. There was a military battle waging, supported mostly by the communist countries, and there was civil resistance, and in fact the non-violence resistance was largely supported by the European governments, European NGOs, and American NGOs, and later the American government. So in many ways, violence was embedded in the South African struggle, even during non-violence, because we know that the government responded very, very violently to those who opposed the system. In particular, violence against women is now one of the most difficult and seemingly intractable problems in South Africa. And my particular interest in transitional societies is about what happens to women. We know that with what has happened in Libya, in Egypt, and so on, women's groups are arguing that they've been removed from the processes of the new democracy. And it is, if 52% of the population is excluded, I think that we have large questions about whether we are talking about a democracy. So before I talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I just want to talk a little bit about a culture in South Africa, a violent culture that has been very, very hard to dislodge, and that in fact bedevils the democracy, the democratic project. And in my scholarship, I focus on what I call a sort of a trifecta, 3 cultures that have sort of combined to create some of the problems and how the TRC dealt with that. The first is a military culture. The apartheid government, white South Africans made up 10% of the population, and 90% of the population were disenfranchised. And it was largely through military means and a very, very effective legal system in which the majority of the population were kept essentially in control. And the military culture was very important, and the government used military might to suppress opposition. The second, though, is another troubling feature, is the culture of resistance. And Dr. Chenoweth mentioned this, sort of the idea that violent uprisings creates within themselves. The African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress were violent, and that violence was very much part of the clandestine operation that they had to conduct and part of the culture. And the third is this is always a very difficult issue, and that is traditional society. Indigenous society also had within their structures levels of violence, particularly against the young and against women. Clearly, it was different, and people argue quantitatively different, qualitatively different, but I think those are the cultural features that one has to look to when looking at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. For myself, I sort of thought about when the TRC and how you go from authoritarian to democracy. In 20 minutes is very difficult. I've written a few articles on this. So what I thought I'd do is sort of encapsulate it in these 4 questions, encapsulate my comments in these 4 questions. How does a society heal the collective trauma and devastation caused by brutality and atrocities? How does a society pay tribute to and provide reparations for individual victims? What counts as reparations? And what is the most appropriate method for a society to punish the perpetrators? So the TRC was I know that the South African TRC often, I don't know how many people in this room know about the TRC, but the TRC is sort of seen as the gold standard for how a society reconciles itself in the wake of atrocities. But the TRC, firstly, was a compromise, a huge compromise, because it was clear that Nuremberg-style trials would not work in South Africa. There were essentially no winners and no losers. The military wing of the ANC was never going to defeat the South African government, and the South African government was never going to defeat those who resisted apartheid. So the TRC is in fact a compromise, and I'm always amused when I travel around how the TRC is viewed inside South Africa and how the TRC is viewed outside of South Africa, because there's lots of, in South Africa, although people believe that the TRC had to happen and South Africa absolutely needed this process to move from apartheid to democracy, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the TRC, and it's in fact unfinished business. But the compromise essentially was about 3 committees that would comprise the TRC, the Human Rights Committee, the Amnesty Committee, and the Reparations Committee. So the first thing, the Human Rights Committee, just to go back, the Human Rights Committee was the public face of the TRC. The Human Rights Committee was Bishop Desmond Tutu and the commissioners sitting in a room with the victims, telling their stories, talking about the pain and trauma, and the perpetrators coming forward. It was a theater of reconciliation and penance. And it had a very, very religious feeling about it. And I think it was because Bishop Tutu was put as head of the commission. So the Human Rights Committee is what everybody saw. It was the public face of the TRC. What was interesting, and I think this is a very, very good feature of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I think other societies can learn from this, is that in South Africa, every night while the TRC was happening, there was a program of, initially it was 1 hour, afterwards it became half an hour, in which South Africans could witness what the TRC was doing. So there was a national education going on, and the TRC became part of the sort of collective legacy of South Africa, and South Africans argued about what the TRC meant. And there was a lot of argument, there was a lot of dissent, but it was a good education. So, of course, for the Amnesty Committee was to grant amnesty to the perpetrators, and the Reparations Committee was to look at reparations. But these were some of the difficulties that the TRC confronted. As I said, white South Africans made up 10% of the population. South Africa was not just a country in which soldiers shot protesters. South Africa was a country in which every feature of life of South Africans was governed by a set of laws. Who you married, where you went to school, where you lived, a range of where you could work. So all the rights that we take for granted, all the rights and privileges in a democratic society, was denied the majority of South Africans. In South Africa, for a long time, the notion of a black family was a misnomer, because only men were allowed to go to the cities and work in the cities, and women were to remain behind in homelands that were set up, artificial governing structures. So the fabric of South African life was determined in a way that was ultimately destructive to large sections of the population. So we are talking about millions of victims. The TRC, therefore, had to distinguish between ordinary victims of apartheid and extraordinary victims. And in the end, there were 22,000 victims, a small number. And these were the victims who were tortured, who were seen as individuals who really were subjected to gross violations of human rights. The second was there was no blanket amnesty. Chile, Guatemala, many of the countries in Central and South America had a blanket amnesty. For South Africa, truth was exchanged for amnesty. So if you told the truth, you would be granted amnesty. But the third feature about the TRC, the compromise, which was the most difficult, was that the violence of the apartheid government was seen as equal to the violence of the liberation movement. So the TRC was victim-centered, and the TRC did not make a distinction between who caused the harm, whether it was an apartheid soldier or whether it was a liberation movement soldier. The TRC saw both as perpetrators. And that, of course, created all kinds of issues around the symbolism. Do you equate apartheid violence with those who oppose it, the moral issues, and so on. We don't have a lot of time to go through that. And the other thing was the idea of, this is the debate, two nights ago I was with a friend who works at the United Nations, and he tells me that, in fact, the TRC is probably in violation of international law, that more and more human rights advocates see punishment as important, and that the TRC is seen as soft, and that human rights advocates are more and more saying that, believe that perpetrators should be brought before an international tribunal. And so at the moment there's this discussion, the establishment of the International Criminal Court has meant that the TRC to some extent is seen as not sufficiently effective. And there was a challenge to the TRC in 1996 in which the judges of the Constitutional Court determined that, in fact, the constitutional obligation to give effect to what South Africans had agreed to was more important than the international legal responsibility to punish perpetrators, and in fact allowed the TRC to continue even though victims were highly dissatisfied. Certain set of victims that perpetrators would be granted amnesty for both criminal and civil liability. What happened as well with the TRC were the tensions between justice, truth, and reconciliation. Everybody believed during the constitutional negotiations that if victims stood before a tribunal and talked about their pain, and if perpetrators came forward and acknowledged the pain of the victims, that would lead to a healing process, and it would lead to reconciliation. And in fact, it just largely did. But during the hearings, and I had some junior law students who interned at the TRC for the 2 years that the TRC operated, that in fact at moments when everybody thought reconciliation was supposed to happen, revenge was very much in the air. That the pain that people in the audience, because the audience became like a jury, that at times Bishop Tutu, and because it was a very good strategic choice to have Bishop Tutu as head of the TRC, in effect was able to counter some of the anger and some of the hostility and bitterness that surfaced during the testimony. But there's always been, and this has been the big debate, the balance between truth, reconciliation, justice. Do you compromise justice for the sake of truth? And so these are ongoing issues. And then the national narrative. Whatever the TRC, the most fundamental, for me, the most fundamental importance of the TRC was that it placed in the institutional memory and as the history of South Africa that these happened. Nobody can deny that this happened. It is part of the record. It is part of the historical record. The beneficiaries of apartheid cannot say that this didn't happen. So denial is not an option. But the problem with the TRC is, as I said earlier, the narrative was one, and I think I've got 2 minutes left. The narrative was one of good versus evil, black versus white. But in actual fact, that was not how the TRC played out. Because the number of perpetrators, and this is a very, very ironic fact, that those who applied for amnesty in South Africa, the greatest percentage were black South Africans. That in effect, there was a huge amount of violence being perpetrated by black South Africans upon others, blacks in the homelands, blacks who were soldiers, blacks who were involved with the government, as well as the beneficiaries. White South Africans clearly benefited from apartheid, but not all black South Africans were disadvantaged in the same way. This raises questions about economic justice and so on. Again, complicated issues which I won't go into. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the constitutional framework, but I don't have time. So just the sort of looking back, it is clear that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was not a panacea for the problems of South Africa, and particularly the lingering violence and the lingering social and economic inequalities. The victims have not been, many of the victims have not been paid the reparations that were due to them. Many of the perpetrators did not tell the truth, even though there are questions about whether they were granted amnesty and whether they should have been granted amnesty. So I thought I'd get a cartoon to sort of give you a sense of how South Africans view the TRC, the reparations. So you can see there, these are the excuses and the payout. So there's some reluctance to, there the victims being stranded on an island and the government sort of going ahead and ignoring them. The idea that you see Bishop Tutu handing the TRC report to President Mbeki and the military talking about what they did, because lots of evidence was destroyed as well. And then finally, Bishop Tutu, what is happening in South Africa now is that there's been in the last 2 years talks about a blanket amnesty because the South African criminal justice system cannot deal with dealing with each individual perpetrator. And so to some extent the TRC has been a good process, but certainly a process that has huge flaws. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Relax for a minute. You want to save the changes you made? What is that? I don't need it unless I have to use it. Do I have to use it, anybody? Somebody going to tell me. Okay, I'll stay near the podium at least. Okay. I'll wait for people to get seated. First, I'd like to thank everybody that everybody else has thanked, but particularly point out the wonderful work that the law review students have done. At our breakfast before the presentations, I spoke to a few of the law review students, and each time I asked them, did you get much sleep last night, the answer was, well, no. And one of the reasons is life doesn't stop for them. They still have to prepare for class, get to class, do their editing, and they've put together this wonderful program. So I really, really appreciate the work that the law review folks have done and the hospitality they have created. The second thing I'd like to say by way of preface is I never set foot in Morocco. I did live in Macedonia. None of that will be on the test. Finally, while at its best, most people use PowerPoint to educate the audience, for me, it's mainly to remember what I'm going to say. And it occurred to me as I heard the news this morning that perhaps Rick Parry might try PowerPoint himself. Okay, with that, I'm going to see if I can get to my next page. Transition to democracy in Spain. I was on sabbatical in Seville, Spain, not working on political transition, but working on a comparative project concerning environmental regulation at multi-government level with the European Union and Spain and that kind of stuff. My best friend that I had was a professor named Jesus Jordano. And so there's nothing religious about the first line. And at one point, after being in Spain for a number of months, it occurred to me that nobody ever talked about Franco or the Civil War. This is in marked contrast to the South African approach of having a truth commission, where the sense is truth makes you clean, truth leads to democracy, truth leads to a clean slate. The Spanish experience may have been the first major transition of the winding down Cold War period, at least. And it was very successful, as the South African one seems to be rather successful at this point, notwithstanding some of its problems. Both of them were peaceful, at least largely so, but they took a very different approach. Jesus said to me, we don't talk about the Civil War or Franco because it was such a horrendous experience for everybody. It was half the country against another half of the country. A huge percent of the population was killed, injured, starved to death, or put into exile. And we figure that we don't want to go through that again. And the implication was there was enough division latent in the society between conservative supporters, to some limited degree at least, of the old Franco regime, and new supporters of progressive democracy, that it would be dangerous to talk about it. And this was in the mid-90s. That's 2 decades after Franco died. It seemed to me by the mid-90s that shouldn't have been much of a problem. Spain was a member of what was then called the European Community, now called the European Union. It was a member of the European human rights system. I didn't quite get why the silence had to be so complete, but it pretty much was. So while, like South Africa, Spain's transition was a peaceful one, unlike South Africa, Spain's transition was a forgetful one, and seemingly by unspoken agreement, which sometimes was referred to as the Pacto de Olvido, the pact of forgetting. I had this in mind for a few years, or I had it in the back of my mind for a few years. In addition to working on international environmental issues, I was becoming more active in international human rights issues and refugee issues. And then reading the news in the late 1990s, we all read about Pinochet being arrested in London on the basis not of a Chilean request or a British request, but on the basis of a Spanish request for a warrant against him, charging him with genocide, terrorism, and other crimes against humanity. A request from a Spanish judge to a British court to arrest a Chilean dictator seems strange to me, the kind of thing that makes a human rights professor think about. The judge in the case, and by judge I mean here prosecuting judge, was a Spanish guy, many of you may have heard of, a guy named Baltasar Garzón, who in the next few years became famous for being a crusader for what we call universal jurisdiction, the right of any civilized country to try a criminal against humanity in any place that the person can be brought for a legitimate trial. The Spanish had a statute on their books that said you could do it. It was a pretty obscure statute, but Garzón and other prosecutors like him started developing the jurisprudence under this statute. Apparently, one of the reasons that this happened in Spain was that a lot of Chileans and Argentines who had been victims of the dictatorships in the Southern Cone countries in South America in the 1970s and early 80s fled to Spain. So using a process of kind of private attorney general complaints, they got Spanish judges interested. Once the Spanish prosecuting judges were interested, they took over and things went from there. Remember, at this point, while there was movement toward an international criminal court, there was no international criminal court. The only criminal courts post-Nuremberg that existed at this time were very specialized courts for the former warfare in Yugoslavia, the warfare in former Yugoslavia, and the genocide in Rwanda. So nothing existed to deal with somebody like Pinochet. I thought back to Jesus, and I said, aha, Garzón is not as much interested in prosecuting Pinochet because he's concerned about Chile. This is a metaphor. It is an outlet for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that never existed in Spain. So now I want to flash back to Spanish history because its transition was a long one. The Spanish Civil War occurred between 1936 and 1939. Essentially, it was a war that pitted fascism with support from Hitler and Mussolini through the leader of the rebels, Francisco Franco, against a elected Republican government in Spain. The government in Spain in 1936 was probably a left to center-left democratically elected government, had some socialist influence, but it was basically a coalition. The government had been somewhat polarizing in attacking the institutions of traditional Spain, particularly the church. With the help of Hitler and Mussolini, in 3 years, Franco succeeded in conquering Spain at the cost of, I believe it was million, you know, the cost in lives was in the low millions. It might have been in the high 100,000s, but it was a lot for the country the size of Spain. At first, Franco's government, I think, truly could be considered fascist. And he was allying himself with folks in 1939 who seemed about to conquer the world. The repression inside Spain in the first few years after the war, most of the 1940s, was pretty extreme. The philosophy was fascist, and repression, torture, arrest, you might even say political genocide was the rule. The original resistance to this was in the form of a guerrilla war by left-wing elements who were sure, given that Franco was the ally of Hitler and Mussolini, notwithstanding that Spain remained neutral during World War II, a resistance that was sure that the allies, the United States, France, Britain, would come to its aid and throw Franco out after they got done with Hitler and Mussolini. They didn't, and the guerrilla resistance, which continued for a few years, eventually petered out because it was overwhelmed by Franco's forces. At the same time, Franco apparently and wisely, in quotes, realized that it was time to make a pivot. He saw who won the war, and he very cleverly stopped using quite as much fascist rhetoric, tried to paint himself as mainly a bulwark against communism. The United States, during the beginning of the Cold War, bought it and pretty much saved his political butt. An analogy here. We ended up continuing the Franco regime for decades in Spain, much as we may be accused in the pre-Arab Spring of perpetuating dictatorships in that part of the world. There was legitimate and sincere change in the 1950s and 60s in Spain. It didn't change into the kind of government that I would like, and I assume not the kind of government that most of you would like, but it more or less went from a truly fascist government as it started to a government of technocrats, economic liberalization, expansion of wealth from a country that was certainly as impoverished as as most parts of the third world in the 1940s, to a country that was coming close to other European standards by the 1960s. And these technocrats and relative reformers also realized that to enjoy the benefits of being close to Europe, they had to look a little bit more like a European democracy. And in what I call a proto-transition, people like Manuel Fraga within the Franco regime passed new freedom of press laws. Freedom would be an overstatement, but dissent started gradually occurring. So that by the early 1970s, when Franco, God bless him, was still alive, most people were looking forward to an actual transition to some kind of democracy. Spain's neighbors by this point were relatively rich. They were fully democratic. Lots of Spaniards were working at jobs in Western Europe. And it seemed like a kind of place that they wanted to be part of. Franco had appointed a grandson of the last king of Spain, who was essentially kicked out by that Republican government that I talked about. The grandson, Franco hoped, would be, to some degree, his successor, Franco's successor, and keep Spain Catholic, traditional, authoritarian, etc. The king quickly realized that that was not the way the wind was blowing, and was able to mediate between the different factions in Spain and get the moderate Democrats and the center-left and the center-right all together in a grand coalition that essentially created the Spain we had today by the formation of a constitution that is a modern constitution that guarantees all the civil liberties and that we would expect in a good modern constitution, and guarantees some social rights that we do not have in our constitution. It also resulted in an amnesty law, which essentially put into statute the kind of forgetfulness that the Spanish felt was necessary in order to keep themselves from tearing each other apart. And folks have noted the close linguistic relation between amnesty and amnesia. Spain's amnesty certainly was an amnesia. It was called a pact of forgetting informally in the literature of those people that analyzed it. In 1982, I believe, a very marginalized right wing of military leaders tried to have a military coup, and they invaded the legislature, which was at that point democratic. There was some real concern that fascism would return for a few hours. The king went on TV in his marshal's uniform as commander-in-chief of the army and said, I want all you fellows to go back, because it was fellows at that time, I want all you fellows to go back to your barracks. And the coup failed. Spain had a king that probably gathered the kind of reverence, almost, that Nelson Mandela had in South Africa. And one might ask the question, when you have contrary sides, is a saintly leader really a major, major asset? We wouldn't like to think that success in democracy is dependent on a single person. But clearly in Spain and South Africa, you have a couple of cases where it was. I think I talked about that. So what we had through the 80s was a quiet, forgetful development of democracy. Spain joined the European community. Spain accepted human rights systems. And then in the late 1990s, as I originally said, exiles from Chile and Argentina convinced lawyers in Spain to take this theory of universal jurisdiction as a way of promoting human rights. And it refers to some extent to what the previous speaker was referring to concerning the human rights community feeling like there should never be amnesty for human rights crimes. The most important legal decision it resulted in was the House of Lords decision in the Pinochet case that said exactly that, pretty much, that there is no immunity from a crime against humanity. Pinochet ultimately was not prosecuted in Spain because the British government, not the House of Lords, had the final say, and as a matter of discretion said he's too old and sick to be tried. Spain went on to try, or attempt to try, many other folks, Argentine colonels and torturers. Then it expanded to investigating Chinese crimes in Tibet. And what we had after a decade of this flurry of universal jurisdiction, not just in Spain, but in other European countries like Belgium, was a wane of universal jurisdiction. It waned because it really had very limited success. While it got some good legal opinions, it convicted very few people for procedural reasons, sometimes for lack of being able to actually get them physically there. Because of the political awkwardness of some of the prosecutions, people could most decent people could agree that Pinochet was culpable. Whether it was wise to prosecute Henry Kissinger or the leaders of China for Tibetan actions became much more controversial and created political awkwardness. On the better side, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, finally took hold in that decade between late 1990s and the 2000s, and the need for national-based universal jurisdiction became less. And finally, and I think most importantly in Spain, Franco's victims, after a generation since his death, finally did get a voice. The pact of silence was certainly breached by the time Zapatero was elected president of Spain, and the Spanish legislature actually passed a law condemning the 1936 coup by Franco as illegal. And today, it is not taboo to talk about Franco, and its victims are having much to say. So finally, belatedly, there is some truth in reconciliation. Let me really briefly discuss what I see as similarities, dissimilarities to the Arab Spring, as my previous colleague has done. One could debate whether the neighborhood you are politically in makes a difference in a transition to democracy and makes a difference in whether it's peaceful. It seems Spain was in the perfect position. Western Europe had pretty much totally democratized by that point. Plus, there was the economic pull of the European Union. You don't have that exact situation in the Arab world. Though quick communication, the internet, great international trade, has shrunk neighborhoods, so some could argue Europe's right next door, and they see democracy, and they are affected by that. And it's also brought through their computer screens. Another similarity, and I think this should be a lesson for us, is that in both cases we supported dictators. In both cases there were long-term dictators. And we might think as citizens of this country that we want to be on the right side of history more quickly next time. The Spanish transition was clearly nonviolent. The Arab transition, some were not. Tunisia tended to be a very nonviolent transition and apparently successful given the recent election. Egypt was mostly nonviolent, heavily nonviolent, though the jury is out on whether the military dominance is going to be dislodged or not. One hopes it is. On the other hand, it seems like in instances where there is ethnic, tribal, or religious tension, peaceful transitions are more difficult. And I was happy to hear that the main speaker, who I've not heard before and was very impressed by, present the thesis, which I agree with, that most of the time nonviolent transitions are going to be more effective and better in the long run. But I think, you know, in her 20% of situations where more or less where nonviolent transitions fail or violent transitions actually succeed, I think there's often an element of ethnic, tribal, or religious tension. And in the Arab Spring, we have the situation of Bahrain, where the Shiite minority is being repressed, Libya, where you had tribal differences between the East and the West, and Syria, where the Alawite minority is the militarily repressive group. I think that's an issue for further discussion, but I don't have the time to discuss it myself. Finally, just to give it a plug, Occupy Wall Street. Does this have anything to do with what we're talking about? Are we trying to strain to bring current events in? I would say it might raise the issue of when we talk about transitions to democracy, do we limit ourselves to political structures? We have been talking almost exclusively of transition to political democracy. We are not threatened immediately in this country with a loss of political democracy. If you follow the statistics in the news, we are threatened with a loss of economic democracy. Are the lessons of transition to political democracy and notions of nonviolent resistance in some way applicable for our future decades in promoting a transition to economic democracy? That's my strained analogy. Thank you.
Again, we have time, very short time for a question or two for either Professor Friedberg or Professor Andrews or both.
This question is for both of you to address. You both spoke about sort of the reluctance among the human rights community now to see amnesty as a viable response. And be that as it may, practically speaking, with a society trying to go forward and go about the business of governance, is it still a necessity? And sort of how that would roll into balancing the perspective of the human rights community versus the actual practical business of moving forward and keeping a country running. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think that the question of punishment is not necessarily a necessity, but it's a strong preference in the international human rights community. I think the question of amnesty and how a society transitions is very much a domestic one. If the perpetrators and the victims have to live within the borders, then I think that revenge and punishment sets a tone that's not necessarily conducive to a reconciled society. And so each situation, I think, needs to be addressed on its own terms. I think South Africans had to live together, and the TRC was the best of all the options. But I think that there is a compelling argument that certain gross violations of human rights should be, is of such international concern that I think, for example, it's a pity that Gaddafi was murdered. He should have been brought before the International Criminal Court or a tribunal in his own country. So, you know, I think that it's a difficult question. One has to balance the historical record, moving forward, the nature of the society, ethnic, tribal divisions, and so on.
I agree with all that. I think it's a rebuttable presumption that that gross human rights violations should be punished. And I think the presumption is reversed once a state like South Africa or Spain creates a democratic system that doesn't punish because it thinks it's wiser not to. but I still think that second presumption could be reversed if you show such outrageous behavior that humanity simply can't tolerate a mass murderer, for instance, getting off without punishment. That's a very fuzzy, messy approach, but I don't think we'll do any better than that.
Before we adjourn for class change, I want to give our professors
Okay. Yes, thank you. I've never thought, what a wonderful opportunity.
Our two speakers in this hour are Professors Donald Kochan and Daniel Serwer. I'd like to introduce each of them to you. Professor Kochan is on the law faculty at Chapman University in Southern California. He attended Cornell Law School, after which he clerked for the Sixth Circuit and then practiced in Washington for Crowell and Morin. He began teaching law at George Mason in 2002 and has been at Chapman since 2004. He's published over 25 scholarly articles and essays in well-respected law journals, including the Berkeley Journal of International Law, the Fordham International Law Journal, and the George Washington International Law Review. But he didn't reach the pinnacle of publishing success until 3 years ago when he published in the West Virginia University Law Review. Professor Kochan recently had one of those moments we would all like to have. He wrote an op-ed piece for the Wall Street Journal. It was noticed by a United States senator who then took it to a Senate hearing that was being conducted to examine Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and he brings it to her attention. Not bad. The subject of that essay is the same subject on which Professor Kochan is speaking to us today, the role he believes the United States should take in societies that are in transition to democracy. Our other speaker is Professor Daniel Serwer. He holds degrees from Haverford, the University of Chicago, and Princeton. Dr. Serwer served from 1994 to 1996 as U.S. Special Envoy and Coordinator for the Bosnian Federation, mediating between Croats and Muslims, and negotiating the first agreement reached at the Dayton peace talks. Very important work. From 1990 to 1993, he was Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Rome. Before arriving at his current position at Johns Hopkins, he was Vice President for Peacebuilding Innovation at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And there he led teams working on a wide variety of matters, including, especially for our, significantly for our purposes, the rule of law. He led the Institute's peacebuilding work in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the Sudan, and the Balkans. He also served as executive director of the Hamilton Baker Iraq Study Group in 2006, which many of you will remember. He's currently a professorial lecturer and visiting scholar in conflict management, as well as a senior fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins. In his talk, Professor Serwer will look ahead to the transition phase when resistance succeeds and to the prospects for reform when it does not. Professor Serwer.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I can't even pretend to root for your football team, but I don't watch football at all. But I do watch nonviolent protests, and though I don't look like it today, I do need to lay my credentials on the table. Yes, I have sat down in the middle of a street in Cambridge, Maryland, to see the National Guard facing me with gas masks fixed and bayonets fixed. Yes, I have been gassed at Fort Dix. And most proudly, I was the author of the plan for support to the Serbian opposition that eventually succeeded in overthrowing Milosevic. Actually, not even overthrowing him, defeating him in an election and getting him to step down. So I don't look like it today, but picture me long hair down to my shoulders and in blue jeans, and there I was. I've remained a great enthusiast for nonviolent rebellion. I'm also a great enthusiast for Erica Chenoweth's quantitative methodology, but I'm going to rely today on a much less impressive technique, the techniques of historian and diplomat, which are more stories. In social science, you call them case studies, but really they're about telling stories. The Arab Spring is far from over, but I do want to focus a little bit on the forward look, the next transition phase. I'm absolutely convinced of the efficacy of civil resistance, as Dr. Chenoweth has outlined it. But I'm also convinced that the transitions get very complicated and very difficult. And we've heard already from two people who've described dramatically different transitions in South Africa and in Spain. And this is the first lesson, it seems to me, of this business, which is that context matters. The history of a place, the character of a place, the neighborhood of a place, it all matters enormously. Let's take a look at three ongoing cases, Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, in all of which I think it's fair to say the initial stages are over. In Tunisia, you're seeing something really quite remarkable. The autocrat left the scene pretty quickly. The regime was pushed aside fairly easily, and you've already had first elections that, and you have a pretty clear roadmap ahead. Good chance here, it seems to me, of consolidating a democratic regime. Nothing's for sure, but Tunisia's got good prospects. In Egypt, the autocrat also left rather quickly, but the regime was not pushed aside easily, and the protesters called the army in to help with the transition, to really manage the transition. It's doing that, but it's doing it in a way that preserves and consolidates its control over foreign policy, over security, and over a big slice of the economy as well. I'd say there's much less chance of success in this transition. I've been in Egypt recently. I must say I found it discouraging, and I thought many of the people I talked to were discouraged. It might be, in the best of cases, a little bit like Serbia, where in Serbia there was also a deal made with the security forces. I don't think that deal was necessary, but Zoran Đinđić, who was one of the leading politicians, did, and he made a deal with the security services that essentially said, we'll let you stay in place. We're not going to purge you. We're not going to come after you if you'll step aside and let us take power. Something like that might be happening in Egypt. I think it's that kind of transition is slow and halting. I think it's not the best way to go, but really it's up to the Egyptians to decide in the end. When I was in Tahrir Square just a few weeks ago, the entire focus of the demonstration was on removing the remnants of the old regime, removing them from the media, removing them from powerful positions in the economy. This is ironic because the night I was there was the night the Israeli embassy was attacked. So nothing in the press here, there wasn't a line devoted to what was actually happening in the Tahrir Square. It was all devoted to the violent protest against the Israeli embassy. Things look very different when you're there and up close than what they look like through the lens of our media. In Libya, we had a violent revolution, and it swept away the old regime completely. I am more optimistic about Libya than a lot of people are. I'm willing to entertain the proposition that this is going to come out reasonably well. Why do I feel that way? Well, first, I think they've had pretty good leadership that has in part already stepped down and made way for other people. They had fairly good planning. The stabilization team that planned the takeover in Libya for several months from outside the country did quite a good job. And I think they have ample resources. In the week in Libya, in Benghazi, and Tripoli, I didn't find a single person asking me about the economic situation or telling me about the economic situation. Nobody told me, I don't know where my next meal is coming from. Why not? Because they have no reason to be preoccupied with that. The Social Security payments are all still being met. The bread and other staples are still being subsidized. The new regime has been able to maintain those aspects of the old regime and make the transition much easier for a lot of people than it often is, certainly much easier than it's been in Egypt. The big threat are these militias and the quarrel over Islamism. Those are the two kind of twin threats that link, actually, because some of the militias are Islamist. But the real problem is just that they don't want to go home. The young guys came in from the Nafusa Mountains. Life looks a lot better in Tripoli than in the Nafusa Mountains. And they don't want to go home. And in a democratic society, they don't have to go home. The problem is that they want to hold on to their guns as well. So that transition can be a very difficult one. It often is a difficult problem, the demobilization and demilitarization of not only the old armed forces of the regime, which has happened almost instantaneously in Libya, but the demilitarization, demobilization of the rebels as well in a violent revolution is a great challenge. Let's talk for a moment about Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain, all of which in some sense or other are still going on. In Yemen, it's an odd situation. It has turned violent, even if the protesters themselves have stuck with nonviolence. The odds of a successful transition to democracy, to me, seem quite small because the opposition to President Saleh that's most likely to take power at this point is the violent opposition, not the nonviolent opposition. And they are no more inclined to democracy than he is. I want to underline here that though it's often said that the United States isn't involved in Yemen, I don't know why that's said. We are deeply involved in Yemen. We arm and train the military forces of Yemen for purposes of fighting al-Qaeda, and they have been used against both demonstrators and tribal opponents of the president. So we are deeply involved in Yemen. And deeply involved in two ways, because our diplomats have been urging Saleh to step down, even while the Pentagon is collaborating extensively with President Saleh, which for him is tremendously validating. Syria could also be headed in a violent direction, though there's still some hope, I think, of keeping it on a nonviolent course, and I think that's vital for success. Violence in Syria necessarily will lead to sectarian and ethnic breakdown. People in violent situations do retreat to sectarian and ethnic identities. It's already happened to some extent in Syria, and that will be very difficult to overcome. We've seen that kind of strife in Iraq. It's what strengthens the regime in some sense, is the fear that people have inside Syria that it's headed in the direction of Iraq if the regime collapses. So I think Syria is a case where I have written a great deal, and others have as well, urging the Syrians to stay with the nonviolent course. Not because it isn't morally correct to rise up violently and with arms against somebody like Bashar al-Assad, but because that route has very little chance of success. Bahrain is an odd case. Protesters have been nonviolent, but the crackdown has been largely effective, unlike Syria and Yemen. A lot depends. I don't think the Bassiouni report is out. Is it out yet, Erica? Do you know? Bassiouni is an American lawyer who has convened a commission to look at the past protests, and he's supposed to report any time now. I think a lot of what happens in Bahrain depends on the contents of that report. It could revive the nonviolent resistance, or it could help the regime to keep the lid on. Well, if I'm going to review the situation in the Arab Spring, I have to also look at, we can't only look at the obvious cases, we also have to look at Morocco and Jordan, at Saudi Arabia and at Oman. What's going on in these places? Make a long story short, each regime in these places, each in its own way, is making an attempt to preempt resistance with reform and with hard cash. The reforms in Saudi Arabia are particularly minimal, but the payments were particularly large. So far, they're largely succeeding, and there's been a lot of commentary about this. Some people think that somehow the monarchies are better than the republics. I think they have been more successful than the republics, and I think there's a good reason for that. In a monarchy, legitimacy does not come from the people. We're used to those first three words of our Constitution, we the people. Well, in a monarchy, we the people may count in the end, but it's not the basis of legitimacy. Blood is the basis of legitimacy. And I think they do have an easier time arguing against radical change, not because they're better, but because their legitimacy doesn't depend on popular support. If you're a Republican leader, even just nominally, like Mubarak, who's trying to pass the country on to his son, it's very hard to argue that there's no room for legitimacy that comes from the people. It obviously should come from the people, even if you haven't allowed that to happen. I don't think it means, though, that the monarchies will succeed forever. And I'm unlike all the Saudi experts who will tell you that everything is just hunky-dory in Saudi Arabia and don't worry about the succession, it'll be fine. That's exactly what I heard about Egypt before it happened. The Egyptian experts all universally said, in fact, they regard this as one of the early indicators of successful revolution, that all the experts agree it can't happen here. I don't think it's a sure thing that it won't happen in the monarchies, and I think in Saudi Arabia the efforts to accommodate change are particularly minimal, and I think they are making a grave mistake not to stay farther ahead of the curve by taking truly meaningful steps to redistribute power and to ensure that their security services are shifting from protecting rulers to protecting the ruled. And this, to me, is the heart of the matter. I asked a journalist recently who spent many years in the Middle East, who's written a recent book about the Arab Spring. I asked him, why do they do what they do? I mean, it obviously doesn't work to crack down in a violent way on these rebellions. And he looked at me and said, that's all they've got. They don't know anything else. They have this apparatus, very extensive apparatus, a large apparatus in Egypt and Libya, and it knows how to do only one thing, which is to arrest, torture, repress as violently as need be. I think it's an untested proposition whether such security services can be reformed in an anticipatory way. Now, I don't think that can be done without a sincere commitment to democracy, because autocrats have reasons for wanting their security forces to be the way they are. They have to be that way in order to protect the regime. They're not there to protect the people. They're there to protect the regime. So you need a profound change in attitude on the part of the regime, that they are prepared not to be protected by the security services, that they are prepared to subject themselves to the will of the people. If that mental change is made, I think it's a reasonable proposition to go and help security forces to reform. I don't think it's a good idea unless that mental change has been made. But that raises the broader question of how America should respond to these rebellions. Not, I think, through embassies. I have served in embassies. I served for 14 years in embassies. I am a great admirer of our embassies, their capacity to do what they do best, which is to convey messages and to report back to Washington. I do not believe they are well equipped to provide support to democratic movements in autocratic countries. Their obligation is to stay on good terms with the autocrat. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to deliver messages and return back messages. You get the odd case like Robert Ford, who gets authorized to go out and join the demonstrations, basically observe them, but in fact he was joining them in some sense. But that's the exception that proves the rule. We simply can't have embassies that give up on autocratic regimes, because we don't know whether those regimes are going to survive or not, and we very often need good relations with them. Our diplomacy is important, but it's important for shaping the environment, not because our embassies are talking with the rebels. What do I mean by shaping the environment? Well, it's everything from hauling Syria up to the Human Rights Council in the United Nations, to how our military behaves in Bahrain. There are 1,000 ways in which you can shape the environment without engaging your embassies in what is basically seditious activity. But it wouldn't be enough to just shape the environment. I think we need programs of support to human rights activists, to activists for women's rights, to activists for democracy in many of these countries where those people are willing to take the risk. But those programs should be administered not through our embassies, not even, I think, through the United States government, but through the variety of mechanisms that we do own to do that kind of thing. The National Endowment for Democracy, International Republican Institute, National Democratic Institute, U.S. Institute of Peace, where I once worked, and a whole plethora of international and national non-governmental organizations like IFES and others. These are the institutions, these are the instruments of civilian power that need to be used against autocrats where we decide that that's in our interest. I'm going to stop there and hope you have questions.
Good afternoon, or good morning, I should say. I also thank everyone involved in organizing this conference and for bringing me here. It's been a pleasant trip, and I'm glad to be presenting today. As mentioned, this is my second interaction with the West Virginia Law Review, and I'm pleased to be expanding on some of the work that I've done in the past. My topic today is going to focus on basically a set of 8 points. starting with the idea that in regimes emerging out of peaceful chaos, or those that what I call peaceful chaos, that transitioning from a nonviolent revolution, there is vulnerability, opportunity, and danger. And when you have all three of those, at the very least, understanding that some replacement regime is going to come into place, then two, there is also this, this vacuum that will exist in the power after the transition, which we know is going to be filled by something. The question is, do we want to be part of the influence in how that is filled, or do we sit on the sidelines? And so that really leads to the third point, which is the fact that there will be competition. Anytime that the vacuum needs to be filled, there will be others interested in filling it as well. Part of what I'll be talking about is what I dub strategic ideological co-optation. That is, if we understand that others are going to be trying to co-opt the movement or the movement after the transition, that those who are interested in the ultimate outcome will need to understand that they need to play part of the game. And continuing then, anyone interested will need to enter the competition for influence, and the United States can be part of that process. The United States can use its soft power. It can use things, as Professor Serwer said, shaping the environment. There are ways in which we can shape the environment, including what I've talked about in my past work and in this work, and that is the, a robust translations program, or the robust dissemination of information and dissemination of works that form the bases for developing institutions within these transitioning societies, developing the legal institutions and learning from the past. I am unabashedly in favor of influencing from a Western liberal standpoint, and that is what I'll be concluding later. But when we are influencing in this either soft power way through institutions such as the State Department or other United States governmental soft power, there are also, as Professor Serwer mentioned, these instruments of civilian power, and I'm completely in favor of trying to mobilize those in using this soft power influence, understanding that, again, the vulnerability and opportunity that exists within these transitioning democracies provides this need for guidance, this need for influence, and there will be opposing competition, which can lead to more disastrous results than had existed prior to the actual transition or change in the peaceful chaos. Finally, we should care about the legal institutions that are created in these parts and try to influence them from this classical Western liberal standpoint. Now, another point that I want to start as a matter of introduction is that we've been talking about transitions to democracy, but we've not necessarily mentioned what democracy should be. And again, part of the premise of what I'll be discussing is that I am in favor of Western liberal democracy as the ultimate outcome. That, however, is not necessarily the outcome that we will get in a democracy. We cannot dictate the exact type of democracy that might come into play. Also, as an introductory remark, you see that in transitioning societies and those emerging out of peaceful chaos, often we focus immediately upon rights and upon the language of rights, rather than the language of institutions and legal constraints. And so one of the things that I hope that the discussion in each of these countries, as well as our discussion generally, is to continue to recognize that the limits on power within the institutions is just as important as the enumeration of rights. The enumeration of powers versus the enumeration of rights is something that the United States struggled with. At its founding, the Federalists and many of the framers did not even believe that we needed a Bill of Rights. The idea was that if you sufficiently constrained the institutions and the amount of power that the institutions had, that you would not need to enumerate rights because there was never authority to violate those things in the first place. This, the protection of rights was just a happy externality of the limitations on power. And so part of the influence that I suggest that we push forward in each of these transitioning regimes is influence that creates legal institutions that are limited in their powers. And I think that much of the classical Western thought about the limitations on power can be influential in the crafting of the institutions. Of course, it will be hard, and there are societal and cultural distinctions that need to be taken into account. But nonetheless, I do believe that there are ways in which this can be effective. The next point of introduction before I get to some of the previous mentioned points is that I do see parallels between political movements generally in much of what I'm going to say. That is that political movements, the political economy of protests, is something which we should be concerned about and understand that protest movements, if they begin in any type of way, such as in Occupy Wall Street, there's a time at which they may not yet be set in their forward motion. They may not be set and need guidance in that regard. And so when I talk about this idea of strategic ideological co-optation, I think about the Occupy Wall Street, and I think about the persons on the right who decried the idea that Occupy Wall Street was going to become co-opted by the labor unions or become co-opted by the socialists or what have you, when they started out as not really having a message. And instead of saying, let's go bring our message to them, if they're looking for it, we said that somehow we did not want to, the right said somehow they did not want to enter into the game, that that was somehow a dirty word, this idea of trying to influence or co-opt the movement or move it in another direction. And I think, unfortunately, the word sometimes has that pejorative value. In the end, however, I want to move more toward this idea of this transition out of peaceful chaos and into strategic ideological co-optation. With nonviolent revolution in particular, displaced governments leave a power and governance vacuum waiting to be filled. Such vacuums are particularly susceptible to what I call strategic ideological co-optation. Peaceful chaos transitions into a necessity for structuring and ordering the governance scheme that will emerge. Nonviolent revolutions tend to become decentralized, unorganized, unsophisticated, and particularly vulnerable to co-optation. Recognizing each of these facts, those with preferences for the direction of such structuring and ordering must understand that they are in competition with others with similar self-interested desires to themselves take advantage of the opportunity to co-opt the chaos and strategically position their own ideological preference in the new governmental structure. If we understand that, then engaging in the actual influencing process, that trying to use some level of influence, whether it be through civil institutions or whether it be through governmental institutions and our soft power, there is this opportunity that cannot be missed. In many nations, or those nations emerging out of peaceful chaos, there's this risk that, for example, in Egypt, there's been a much discussed idea that the Muslim Brotherhood or other more extreme type influences would be able to co-opt the movement, and we would not see a move toward democracy. If we understand that risk, and they are the only ones in the game, they are the only ones trying to actually co-opt in this idea, then surely they might be successful. The competition needs to be there. And when I say the competition, what I mean is that it at least needs to be a level playing field in which individuals hopefully will choose the better path, that indeed the better ideas will emerge as the winners in the competition. But if the ideas are not balanced, if the ideas are not presented, then they can never be considered and they may very well be discarded or never even get into the game. Quite often the winners in a nonviolent revolution are quite united in their opposition to an existing regime, but otherwise disorganized in their movement toward the next regime. As a result, nonviolent revolutions are especially prone to this creation of a power vacuum, and therefore the importance of strategic ideological co-optation becomes ever more important. It is here where the competitors in the marketplace for ideas, and hence the marketplace of the competition for control, must stake their claim and hope to persevere over others. Individuals and collective alike struggle with uncertainties and can fall prey to regimes that promise stability and certainty over the Reformation. There's a risk that people in unsettled Arab countries will choose yet again stability over reform, as they often have in the past, and that if we do not influence in favor of reform, that those who are promising stability in the face of such uncertainty will win. There's a substantial risk in this competition from non-liberal groups, and if we sit on the sidelines, we will fail, and we instead must engage with the competition that's already seeking to co-opt within the region. This emerging marketplace of ideas is especially important in societies in the throes of or emerging out of a nonviolent revolution. Such efforts should be designed with the goal that these individuals will choose these foundations for the formation of their new regimes and that they will reject any counter-proposals. If you are trying to influence them, you must present proposals in one direction or the other. it is in every nation's self-interest to attempt to enter the competition for the accepted paradigm in transitioning countries. I'm not saying something, I am saying something because I do have a Western liberal bias, that that's what I would like to win out. But surely this is simply common sense for most self-interested nations who want to influence, and it would be advice that I would give to, if I were coming from a different perspective as well, to those who wish to influence for their own sake. In the face of political struggles, ideas and ideological visions can play pivotal roles in the development of society. And Western ideas have seen some success in the battle of minds of the people in transition. We can look to the Cold War and the Soviet Union as examples of this, but then again, some of those are still in transitional stages. The idea of the United States or Western liberal thought as a commodity is another that I would like you to consider. Consider manufacturing. Major powers and major schools of thought are the producers of a commodity, the ideas, and the consumers are those who are out in the transitioning regimes. In the case of nonviolent revolutions and strategic ideological co-optation, the strategy for the producer is to convince the target market that the product or commodity is the right one for them. And the challenge is to sell the product. The United States should not back away from that challenge, nor should anyone who favors advancing Western liberal thought. The populations in countries or territories during and immediately after a nonviolent revolution are particularly ripe consumer markets, ready for new ideological products and susceptible to marketing efforts designed to promote the adoption of alternative political products. There is much work to be done, but the fact that a revolution starts as a nonviolent revolution, with seemingly democratic tendencies does not mean that it will stay that way. And it's hardly a foregone conclusion that it will result in something peaceful, democratic, respectful of human rights, or otherwise liberal in the classic use of that term. In fact, quite the opposite is more likely to be true. And idealistic notions of democratic triumph in nonviolent revolutions fail to recognize the intellectual deficit that may exist in the newly free countries that is necessary to develop a legal system that can support and sustain these concepts of liberty and democratic values. The idea that there is not enough information available is part of why I believe that we need to engage in more soft power efforts to influence and provide the material necessary to provide an arsenal for those who wish to engage in this transition toward more liberal systems and more liberal democracies. The emergence of a stable democratic regime with respect for individual rights is hardly inevitable, and every nation emerges from a nonviolent revolution. There will be competition from within and without. Those within the country may, in fact, have a leg up on Western liberal thought because of, as I said, the societal and cultural accessibility. And for that reason, the competition may, in fact, be skewed in their favor. And so if, indeed, the United States wants to influence in these regions, they have to understand that not only must they enter the competition itself, but they also must enter with enough fervor and enough strength that it can overcome the home field advantage of certain other anti-Western ideologies. With the growth of nonviolent revolution, there is a great deal of uncertainty but also opportunity. Steering the train in the aftermath of a nonviolent revolution can be a good conductor, a neutral conductor, or a destructive conductor. There's an opportunity for those in the United States and liberal democracies everywhere to compete for the conductor's seat and to take the train down the tracks toward limited government, individual rights, and free markets. But we do need to get on the train. We must recognize that other people will certainly get control if our ideas are not pushed, and that these power vacuums will be filled by others. The idea of using soft power, that is influence rather than might. Soft power being the leveraging of popularity, power, prestige, other factors which influence without guns, prosperity, envy, enlightenment, experience, all to affect foreign affairs in ways in which hard influence might be rejected. And when I speak of soft power, I do think that we need to focus on the type of soft power which is influential rather than that which is attempting to control the thought. Right? This is the idea that persuasion is best. Those who believe, as some of our speakers have said, those who believe that it would be dictates from the United States or the West is not what I believe is going to be effective, because they most likely will be rejected, and or there will at least be a tension or tendency to fear accepting such advice. But if in fact we simply provide more information, persuasion, then we can hope that the persuasive words win out in the end. Apart from hard power, military intervention or economic intervention, what I've dubbed as strategic ideological co-optation calls for the recognition of power vacuums and intellectual deficits of Western legal thought in the Arab world and other areas where nonviolent revolutions exist, and the need to be on the ground with the ideas and principles that can direct nascent and emerging nations toward positive political ends, grounded in the concepts of liberty and limited government. As I've stated in the past, one of the best ways to do this, I believe, is to provide the classic liberal texts to those nations emerging out of chaos. That is, to continue to disseminate information, whether it be through civil institutions, nonprofit organizations, or through the State Department and other governmental organizations. Translations of classic liberal thought, those things which have influenced the development of our government, have influenced the development of limited government within the United States and elsewhere. Those things which have understood how limited government and institutional restraints, legal controls on the legitimacy of governmental power, what we consider a legitimate sphere of governmental influence, what we consider the types of subjects which can be a part of governance. All of these limits can come from our classic liberal thought like Locke, like our independent judiciary or other systems that have existed and can be further explained and developed, but only if people can understand them. And so one of my basic critiques has been about the State Department's approach has been through their translation program, the Arabic book program. Obviously, I believe that the more translations that can be brought so that Western thought can be understood and disseminated within the Arab world will help advantage the prospects for Western liberal thought to be adopted within such regimes. But the State Department program does exist and was intended to do so, but it has failed quite miserably in that regard. The Arabic book program at the State Department has published only 6 to 10 books per year in its 25 years of existence. It is focused, it's not only a quantity issue, it's a quality issue. Although much of the original documentation as to the creation of the program and the reasons for the program being to advance the dissemination of Western legal thought and Western philosophical thought to the Arab world, despite that we see far different translations being chosen. Some of you may have seen the recent uproar in the media about President Obama's biography being distributed by State Departments and embassies. There's also a translation of that that is provided, but he's really the only president who has a biography. We don't have any of the founders other than Franklin who are involved in this. So some of the founding documents should be advanced in the Arabic book program and are not. There are things like the cultural issues in fiction like the Joy Luck Club, yet we don't have things like this John Locke's Two Treatises of Government translated. We do not have Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations translated. We do not have things like Joseph Story's Commentaries on the Constitution translated. Other classics in understanding how our legal system has developed and how it can be successful in creating limited government and limited controls and protective of rights are not the focus of the program at this time, and are only slightly a focus of programs that are starting to be institutionalized in private or nonprofit organizations. A more robust dissemination of information about legal institutions, the necessity of creating legal institutions that are limited, can help us emerge out of peaceful chaos with a greater sense of movement toward what I believe is a liberal democracy. That is something which has limited government. It is not a foregone conclusion that the transitions, even if they go to democracy, are necessarily going to produce the type of limited government and limited controls that will in fact be needed to protect individual rights, if that is so desired, and I do believe it should be. At this time of unrest and transition in the Arab world, the United States' capacity to communicate our core values of democracy exists. It just needs to be brought to bear. Our capability to translate into Arabic is a necessity. Our ability to communicate Western legal values is a necessity. There's a critical need for that influence. especially when we understand that we are in a competition for influence. There is a competitive marketplace for ideas in each of these emerging regimes, and only when we understand that, and only when we do not unilaterally disengage from it because we believe that co-optation or co-opting a movement would be considered a bad thing or a bad word, it's a reality. It is a reality that we must embrace, that has to, that unless we are engaged, unless we are involved, the competition will have the edge and most likely will win. If people are not hearing alternative voices and are not provided with the alternative information and foundational documents to understand how legal institutions can be crafted, we are at a severe deficit. Thank you very much.
You both talked about influence of the United States, and you specifically talked about examples of Arab Springs throughout all of the Middle East, but left out Iran. And my question is there any influence the United States can have, or even within a nonviolent movement within Iran that could be successful? As we've seen before the Arab Spring actually began, the elections after Iran, there were many protests, but they were quelled. And so my question is, could it be successful, and what do you see the role of the United States in that?
Well, I do believe it can be successful in Iran. I see no reason why not. I think there are more problems with U.S. engagement than Americans are aware of. Our relationship with Iran is actually a very complicated one, and one that is partly covert. And this complicates life a great deal. I think there were clear indications that the Bush administration, for example, supported violent, covert activity in Baluchistan, and probably by the Kurds as well in Iran. Iran is a country of only, most people say 52% of the population says that it's Persian, so it's almost a majority-minority country. If you are involved in supporting violent rebellion in a country, and in particular doing it through minority populations, I think it makes it exceedingly difficult for you to have the credibility with the rest of the population that you require. That said, I do believe, and I must say a number of Iran experts believe, that though President Obama is much criticized for not being more forward-leaning towards the Iranian Green Movement, I do think he basically took the right tone, which was to be supportive but not paint them too much with a red, white, and blue brush. They were much better off as a green movement than as a red, white, and blue one. In particular, one of Israel's leading experts on Iran believes that the administration actually struck exactly the right notes and managed to encourage without appearing to interfere. But these things are very difficult. The shaping of the strategic environment with Iran, when we had troops in Iraq, troops in Afghanistan. I once talked to an Iranian about why they get so excited about Israel, and he said, well, Israel threatens our existence. I said, where? I mean, how do they threaten your existence? He said, you don't know about their support for the Azeri rebels inside Iran. Well, I suspect he was telling the truth, not telling me something. He was telling me something I didn't know, but he was telling me something interesting. The strategic environment around Iran is extremely fraught. and frankly is encouraging Iran to develop nuclear weapons and will encourage Iran to be very forceful and very clever in its repression, which has so far been successful.
Thank everybody for really fascinating talks. And I wanted to talk to you, Donald, a little bit about, first of all, the notion of peaceful chaos and the initial proposition that nonviolent revolutions always are succeeded by this vacuum. When you said that, the case of Poland immediately came to mind, which was a case where there was totally there was a completely dominant solidarity party. They had considerable organization for almost an entire decade leading up to the success, which is a major reason why they had success. And in fact, even after the Solidarity Party was elected and became the new government, the number of protests that continued from members of the Solidarity movement actually increased after the new government came into power, just to make sure that their hands were tied and they did adopt reforms and they were sincere. So it was kind of the opposite of what you were saying. And that does contrast with a case like Iran post-Iranian Revolution, where you did have a vacuum, and it was essentially hijacked by a pretty scary movement that over the next year purged leftist elements and established a theocracy. The other thing I just wanted to ask you about a little bit more was whether you think that the United States can have these sort of soft power influences in places where there's both a low demand for these types of influences and also a low supply for new ideas. So Egypt, I think, is a great example of what I'm trying to get at here, which is that for Egyptians, a huge part of their grievances in the revolution was that they felt like they were living under a very oppressive American-dominated government that had enacted some Western liberal or neoliberal economic policies that completely disadvantaged huge parts of the population. And they actually specifically blame capitalism and Mubarak's practice of it for that. There was also this double standard of, promoting human rights and democracy out of one side of our mouths, and then continuing to arm Mubarak and now the army and supply them with considerable weapons with which they are continuing to crush nonviolent protesters. And so I wonder if a better option might be to self-limit the claims instead of talking about restricted government and then actually arming a government to not be restricted toward them, to maybe talk about encouraging them to design a system based on consent. The other thing is about just the low supply of new ideas. And from this, I just wanted to bring up the point that from the United States perspective, I think there is actually considerable ambivalence here about what self-limiting institutions actually look like. I mean, I think if you ask the average Democrat on the street what they think about when they think of self-limiting institutions, they'll give you a very different answer from a Tea Party activist or your average Republican. So I don't even know that we have a solid vision of what that looks like for other places. And I think we have a high degree of ambivalence, particularly about what we want it to look like in Egypt, and especially about what type of vision of self-limiting institutions we want to see there and who it empowers in the societies to have these types of institutions. So I actually see the problem as more of a problem of low demand plus low supply rather than a problem of strategic ideological co-optation.
As to your first question, I don't think that peaceful chaos necessarily follows every transition. So I do take your point there. I do think that there is some level of uncertainty that does follow at any point, and so the broadness of the claim, if I made it that way, should be tempered. As to the supply and demand issue, the demand obviously needs to be repaired if we wish to influence, and no matter what our definition of self-limiting government would be. And so that repair is obviously going to be an obstacle, and I recognize that as a mechanics issue that may make it difficult for any success in a attempt at strategic influence through soft power. One way to help combat that is to do more of this through private or non-governmental organizations rather than with the stamp of the United States on the material that they're receiving. And so the Arabic book program may very well not be the best way to have translations transmitted, for example, and maybe we should instead be funding more private efforts in that regard. As to the other factor on the demand side of our hypocritical stances, certainly have hindered us, and I would hope that on an ongoing basis I would not be in favor of any type of army or hard power that is contrary to basic human rights. And obviously that ruins our standing in the world, and we have to face those consequences. And again, it's an accepted limitation on the potential success of any program of influence. Hopefully there are lessons that we can learn that there will be, or have, now that there have been so recently, nations emerging from nonviolent revolutions, and we're in a position to not have much credibility in our influence. Perhaps we should think for the future as to how we maintain that credibility, so when this happens in the next time, and we do want to influence the transition, we'll be in a better place to do so. How we do that immediately, in the current situation, I don't know. Other than there are different ways in which people define soft power and how they try to implement it. I do believe that any attempt has to be focused more on the provision of information and the availability of information for self-consumption without much direction, and then hopefully rely on its persuasive value rather than dictating our values, which will, in fact, I do agree, have resistance. And so people will not want to be told what to do. But if they can have the bases upon which they can learn things that perhaps have not been taught or have not been available, then hopefully they'll choose on their own and can see which they wish to choose. As to the supply side, it's a legitimate critique. As I said, I'm unabashedly in favor of one direction in some ways, and I'm not sure that that can be controlled. But I do think that whatever your view of the self-limiting nature of our government, it's all come from the same historical foundations. The interpretations may be different, but I do think that there's the possibility of at least providing some of the foundational documents, and to understand then afterwards how we've transitioned either in ways that we ourselves have either matured or fallen away from, depending on your perspective along that line. So respecting both all angles of what constitutes self-limiting is something that we should strive for, and again allow for the competition of the ideas to be there. But I do think that if they're not exposed to any of it, what we have to offer, obviously, the Arab world as well as elsewhere is exposed to information. I'm not trying to say that there's not a corpus of information from which they have learned about governance, but I do think that there is at least some deficit in the amount of material that has been available from English to Arabic in that regard.
Sure.
Before we adjourn for just a few minutes, Zoom at, let's call it 1 minute after 12. Let's do a round of applause for Between now and 12:30, we're going to have a discussion amongst our panel members. Professor Serwer was about to make a point before we adjourned, and I believe he's going to make that point in the context of the group's discussion that'll be in response to my first question. After I ask my question, we're going to open it up to the audience and have questions from you. Panelists, we want to have a successful civil resistance movement. And the question I want to ask you is, what do we do with the lawyers? Gandhi when he was involved in his resistance to the British, said, lawyers, quit your practices. Judges, come off the bench. You're just giving support to the British. In other resistance movements, the leadership has said, lawyers, stay. Judges, stay and fight. Fight for an alternative vision of justice. My question to you is, which path do you recommend? Professor Serwer, why don't you begin?
Well, to answer this rather specific question, I want to remind you of my first lesson, which was context matters. And I don't think you can answer this question with an answer that will be valid in every context. In some contexts, it's very important to destroy the institutions of the state, and having the judges walk out, it could be a very powerful tool in that respect. In other situations, it's very important that those institutions not be eviscerated. They are not always the institutions used for repression. One of the things that we discovered when we got into Iraq was that, and they vetted the judges in Iraq, it was very interesting. They didn't find a lot of problems with the judges in Iraq. They were more or less, in the first vetting, I think they'd allowed 70, 80% of them to remain in place. Why not? Why weren't they kicked out? Well, the answer was that almost the mechanisms of repression were almost entirely extrajudicial, including killings. They were not done through the courts. There are other repressive systems that have relied exclusively on the courts to do nasty stuff. So context matters. Before we broke, I wanted to make a broader comment about American assistance in transition situations. The reconstruction of, or the construction of a judicial system is an extremely important aspect of transition. There are no rights unless you have institutions in which those rights can be defended. And the institutions of the old regime, more often than not, have to be thoroughly vetted no matter what, and reformed to a large degree. American assistance for this process is much better than it was 10 years ago, but it's still absolutely minimal. And it revolves almost entirely around what we call the formal justice system. But if you go to a place like Afghanistan and ask people, where do you settle disputes, they will tell you that 90% of disputes are settled in informal processes that aren't so informal. They're tribal processes that exist. They are oral. They are not written. And there are very good reasons for using tribal systems. If you ask an Afghan, he'll tell you it costs less. There's no appeal. So decisions get implemented right away, not dragged out in a long procedure. Illiterate people have the same standing in the informal system as literate people, which is not true in a formal justice system. Illiterate people are at a tremendous disadvantage. And there are a whole other series of reasons why they prefer the informal system. In fact, these reasons resemble eerily our reasons for sending disputes to mediation rather than having them settled in court. So we should not be surprised by this. What I'm telling you, though, is that the reconstruction of a system of justice, whether formal or tribal, because tribal systems have big disadvantages. They don't treat women equally for the most part, and they can't settle any disputes between tribes, only within. The reconstruction of these systems is an exceedingly complicated and difficult process. We've doubled and tripled and quadrupled and quintupled the amount of money that we spend on this stuff, and it's still a very, very small amount of money. And I hope to see us recognize that this is one of the vital areas of building institutions that limit power that the United States has to engage with much more in dealing with democratically focused revolutions.
Thank you. Other panelists.
While I agree that in most of these problems context does matter, I think there is some generalization that can be made, to which there are exceptions, admittedly. The role of lawyers, I think, is very, very different in the deconstruction phase and the reconstruction phase. I think Gandhi was mostly right for most situations in the deconstruction phase that lawyers need to reject law which usually in that phase has been corrupted in service of tyranny. There may be exceptions where there's enough counterplay of some independent judiciary where you can do something through the law, but with a further exception that I'm going to hold off till the end, not usually. I think Gandhi was mostly right in the first phases of revolution. But in the reconstruction phase, those lawyers have to take out their books again because they are probably among the most useful people in building the constitutions and statutes and institutions that are needed. So it depends on the phase. Now, my exception to this, and this hasn't really been brought up in this panel, but I think it's important in the background. In the last half century or more, we have had a significant change in international relations and international law where sovereignty has become less absolute and less overwhelming. Among the phenomena that flow from that is the importance of human rights, and in some limited circumstances, the ability of human rights to control misbehavior within national borders. Where lawyers, even in the deconstruction phase, have access to human rights courts, human rights commissions, etc., in a way that can put international pressure on their tyrannical governments, their lawyers, qua lawyers, might be of some value. Gandhi was not in that era.
Well, Gandhi was very important in South Africa in establishing, I think, a very crucial role for lawyers in undermining and actually overthrowing an oppressive government. I mean, South Africa is sort of interesting because it was the processes of law that kept apartheid, that buttressed apartheid, and law determined everything. And it was the opposition to apartheid came from lawyers. I was a law student, and I met people like Jack Greenberg and lawyers from the United States who were working in a very conservative environment, even though it's a civil rights environment. But they sort of provided much of the work much of the support for lawyers who were working with trade unions, civil society organizations. And I've been trying to think about why South Africa, the legal revolution in South Africa has been so, I think, quite successful. And I think I make a distinction between lawyers and lawyers' institutions and what lawyers do. I think a society like South Africa where there are different racial and ethnic groups, violence, chaos and so on, the training of lawyers, reason, logic, judgments based on evidence, that I see is the important part of legal involvement in transitions, in that it is the institutions, the way that we are trained, that provides the framework. I mean, Nelson Mandela was a lawyer, but he was also a revolutionary involved in the armed struggle. So I think of it in two ways, the institutions of law, the formal processes of law, but also what lawyers do and what lawyers are capable of. And there's a discussion happening in the public interest movement today in the United States about the role of lawyers in a formal setting like courts, where the courts no longer, particularly the federal courts, are reticent to provide the kinds of equality and other kinds of rights that people have fought for in the past, and it seemed to be eroding. And so I think lawyers have to really think about different fora. And in South Africa, lawyers have lined themselves up with social activists who are working with HIV/AIDS sufferers, homeless people, a whole bunch of social movements. So it's very important. I guess it's my bias. I'm trained in law, so maybe I'm just a legal barbarian and cannot think beyond the confines of my training, my paradigm. But I see South Africa as I was also very struck, the Pakistani lawyers who, at a very, I think, repressive moment in Pakistan, stood up because the government did something that clearly was undemocratic. I must say I found that very inspirational. So, yes, I think, I guess that outside of lawyers, I don't see other organized institutions providing the kind of security, continuity, and so on that lawyers do.
Thank you.
I do agree that context matters. I think one of the tests should be the extent to which they can be trusted and respected. Because if they can be trusted and respected, then the legal profession can be a catalyst for reform, as you said. And they can also be the architects for new regimes. But if they can't, if the actual democratic movement itself cannot trust and respect those individuals that are in the positions, if they can, then we at least need the vetting to get rid of them.
Yeah, I was just thinking about a couple cases that I'm familiar with. The Pakistani lawyers movement is the thing that came to my mind immediately, where lawyers were kind of called on to practice civil resistance, not law, and kind of stand up for what they saw as justice in a very unjust system. And, you know, there were fatalities. I mean, they lost, some people lost
Could you describe the facts surrounding that? Because I'm sure the audience is well acquainted with that.
I'm not the best person to talk about it. I know more about what types of things they were doing and sort of the fatalities rather than the circumstances.
I think the government fired the Chief Justice. That was the fact.
Okay, that's it.
And the lawyers then?
The lawyers responded by launching, well, they boycotted showing up to work, and then they engaged in a number of demonstrations and protests, and it was actually a 2-year-long movement that led to some really important judicial reforms in the country. So it was one of the more effective civil resistance campaigns to date in Pakistan. And, but it was at a high cost to many of them. I mean, they did have to risk their lives in the process. I recently came back from Hong Kong, where I was doing a workshop with some colleagues about civil resistance, and it was at a law school there. And so we had a lot of Chinese students and students from Hong Kong who were being taught about human rights law. And for them, the way that they approach the study of law is to try to figure out how they can restrain their government using its own laws. So the idea there is to try to see what's on the books and how things have been interpreted, and then to push for reforms internally by just forcing the government to observe that this is what you've said you believe in, so practice it. And if you want to do a really dangerous thing, you will be a human rights lawyer in China today because of that. And, you know, I heard some really interesting experiences about people just literally disappearing off the face of the planet. I mean, the regime is extremely savvy about the way it represses, so it doesn't often wield a blunt instrument of outright repression, but people simply disappear. And so there have been a lot of people who are colleagues of these students or the law professors there who had lost colleagues to this type of repression recently. And it's very interesting how they responded, because they couldn't come out and outright say, you know, our regime has done this horrible injustice just because my colleagues spoke out against oppression or something. But they'll say things like, they'll release a report that says, my colleague who's a human rights lawyer here in Beijing has disappeared. We don't know who took him. And a few days later, he was released. And it was the first time they had one of their colleagues return to them. So In other words, they are put in a position to really understand the political nuances about what's acceptable discourse and what isn't. Because the previous press releases they had put out had said, we think the Chinese government came and took this person, and they just never saw them again. So anyway, that's just an anecdote to demonstrate the complexity in many of these situations and how the lawyers that I had contact with there were sort of navigating the waters of reform. But the bottom line for them is that they literally use the laws of the land to try to subvert the institution itself, which is kind of an interesting problem, and probably isn't the way that you learn law, as far as I can know. But anyway, that's just my thought.
Very good. All right, Professor?
I'm a non-lawyer, but to me, if you look at our own history, it in fact used precisely this mechanism. It's the universalist declarations of our Constitution, which have been progressively more realized for more and more of the population, that have been the essence of American history. And on the question of how the institutions behave and at what phase they're useful or not, I really do think context matters. If you think about our own history, what would it be like without the Supreme Court of the United States? What if people of goodwill, rather than sitting on that court, resigned in protest over the system of racial segregation? It would have been a catastrophe for the United States. So I do think context matters.
Very good. Questions from the audience?
Thank you very much to the panelists for coming. This is actually directed to Dr. Chenoweth. In regards to Occupy Wall Street, some of the concern has been the lack of leadership amongst the camp, and now what's breaking out to be violence in several camps. What is the response to, or what is the movement's response to both those concerns?
Well, leadership is always a really interesting question, and I've done some empirical research on the question of how leadership matters, and I haven't found any evidence yet to indicate that systematically having some kind of single figurehead or personality to attach to the movement advantages it more than it could be a liability in a lot of cases. But having some sort of leadership structure does seem to be really important. In fact, we find evidence to show that having even a command and control structure is more likely to lead to movement success than having a decentralized structure. And I think that the reason is because having a more top-down or hierarchical structure actually allows for the more efficient communication and coordination of methods and vision. So there has to be somebody at some point in a movement that says, here's what we want, and make it very concrete. Now, I don't know at what point in a campaign's life this needs to emerge, but I think in terms of the long-term success of the movement and the actual realization of the goals in the long term that they want to see, it is pretty necessary to have some kind of united leadership. In terms of the violent flanks, there are a couple things that movements can do to preempt this type of thing from really spreading. And that's by training and preparation and essentially desensitizing people to how it feels when a police officer comes at you with a gas mask and a fixed bayonet or a baton, and, just the experience of not overreacting to that, which is basically what we see. I mean, I don't even think that in many of these cases the police have provoked the violence. I think people preempted police brutality and just started getting violent in some cases. Not everywhere, but that's true. And so the key is, how do you train people to resist the impulse when they feel afraid? Because that's basically what they're doing, is acting out on an impulse. The other thing that the movement can do, which it hasn't actually done in many cities, is to actually renounce the use of violence and say, if you want to participate, we're a nonviolent campaign. I know in Oakland, for example, the sort of coordinating committee of Occupy Oakland has not yet renounced the use of violent tactics. They have not come out and said we're solely committed to the use of nonviolent resistance. That would be pretty useful for them, if nothing else, to distinguish themselves from the people that are using violence. The other thing that I think about when I see movements with violence breaking out is that what happens when some people turn violent is that it can reduce movement participation because people don't want to be associated with it. And as I mentioned, participation is kind of like the most important thing to get behind a movement. So movement leaders or the core need to really come together and figure out how they can maintain participation in spite of the violence and come up with ways to stop the violence. So in Oakland, for instance, I'm hoping that the next big demonstration, some people form human chains around some of the nearby buildings and make sure that they can't smash windows, and they, form human chains around the police officers to make sure that people who want to start throwing things at them or whatever can't get through the activists. So there are ways to defend people and places, and this could become part of the strategy of the movement to prevent violence.
Elizabeth?
Dr. Serwer, this is for you, and maybe some of the other panelists might want to talk about it. With the ICC coming down with some of the charges against Gaddafi's regime leaders this past week, I was wondering how you feel that how the ICC can facilitate some of the reporting mechanisms that they have with these movements, where maybe they might not have some of the ways to actually report to them directly, maybe by using internet or some of the forward ways that they've been getting their messages out, how maybe they can contact the ICC.
The ICC, it seems to me, especially in a situation like Syria, is desperately in need of information. But whether you can provide information that is really useful in a legal context through a resistance movement, I haven't seen that happening yet, let's put it that way. There's an awful lot of transmission of photographs, of personal testimonies, of, this is, if you're on Twitter or Facebook, you see this stuff all day, every day. But my impression is that very little of it would necessarily meet the standards that would be required of evidence to indict somebody. The ICC wants to be on the ground collecting that evidence, and that's extremely difficult to do. In the case of Libya, they did do it, I think, and they have quite a bit. In the case of Syria, so far as I know, they have not done it except by interviewing refugees in Lebanon and maybe in Turkey. I don't know about that. And that's a useful thing. I thought you were going to ask the broader question about whether ICC indictments are helpful or a hindrance in these situations. And all diplomats except me will tell you that they are a tremendous pain in the ass, that they just make things much more difficult than they would be otherwise. I'm not going to tell you that because I don't think there's any evidence for it at all, and I think there's a lot of contrary evidence to suggest that the threat of indictment and even actual indictment moderates people's behavior. That's certainly the case for the president of Sudan at the moment. I knew a number of potential indictees during my time in Bosnia. There was no question but that the threat of indictment was moderating their behavior. There's more of a quarrel really over actual indictment. And the obvious contrary case in that case is Joseph Kony of the Lord's Resistance Army, where indictment did nothing but drive him deeper into the bush and make him more ferocious and commit more atrocities. But Joseph Kony is a nut. And, the notion that rational calculation would have any impact on him, I think, is the exception that proves the rule. I'm not against indicting these guys. I think eventually the threat of indictment and actual indictment will start to moderate the behavior of autocrats generally.
We're going to give Professor Andrews the last comment.
Two quick comments. I have to disagree about the ICC and the threat of distant prosecutions actually moderating people's behavior. Robert Mugabe, you mentioned Kony, the Congo, certainly the wars in Africa. I would say that the evidence suggests the contrary. I mean, it's hopeful, and the ICC was set up for this reason. But the Rwandan tribunal sits right there in Arusha, and it's surrounded by the most incredible atrocities happening and has been happening for the past decade. Robert Mugabe has been committing gross violations of human rights, war crimes for the last few years. So I'm not sure. It's an optimistic vision that I wish was true, but the Africans, so for me, certainly Central and Southern Africa, it doesn't suggest that. The second problem, I think, with the ICC and the tribunals, Yugoslavia as well as Rwanda, is that it's distant justice. And if it's from a victim's perspective, the actors and what goes on in the court they're arcane institutions, and for the victims who require a certain level of closure and some sense that justice is being done, there's research now to suggest that that's not been the case, for example, in Rwanda. And the ICC has also the question about money, the amount of resources that is spent on these tribunals, the Rwandan tribunal particularly, raises questions about the effectiveness ultimately.
Thank you. In a moment, we're going to invite Jesse Record up here to close out the proceedings. But before we do, I think we need to thank our panelists for an extremely stimulating morning. Thank you.
Well, this will be short and sweet. It's been the Law Review's honor and privilege to host you all. Thank you so much for coming and sharing this morning with us. I think the conversation has been eye-opening and pushed our boundaries a little bit, and that's always a good way to spend a Thursday morning. So thank you all very much. We have a reception set out for all of us in the lobby, and I would invite all of you to join us and carry on the conversation with our participants out there. Also, I'm sure I have Law Review members who are just itching to ask questions, so please corner the speakers if you can out by the buffet. Thank you all for coming.